Chapter 538. Thinking about Rachel telling her to take the initiative, Carolyn took a deep breath and lightly patted the stack of newspapers in her hands. Only then did she use the spare room card that Eric had given her to open the door to Eric's suite. It was already 8:30 in the morning. Carolyn had acted as Eric's interpreter last night and attended a cocktail party with him. Of course, she didn't drink much. However, Eric couldn't resist the enthusiasm of the host and drank a little too much. As a result, he hadn't gotten up yet. After eating breakfast, Carolyn went to a nearby park for a walk. Coincidentally, she bumped into Alan, who was preparing today's newspaper and was planning to wake Eric up. Alan had a very good impression of this girl who had politely greeted him. He also knew that Carolyn liked Eric, so he took the initiative to provide her with an opportunity. Pushing open the door to the luxurious suite, Carolyn stuck her small head into the room to take a look. Seeing that there was no one in the living room, she walked in. Placing the newspaper in her hands on the coffee table, Carolyn walked to the bedroom door and lightly knocked a few times. "Wait a moment." A voice immediately rang out from the bedroom, giving the girl a fright. Before she could react, the bedroom door was suddenly pulled open. Then, a man and a woman stood there in a daze. Eric had just woken up and thought that the person outside was Alan. Just then, he remembered that he had forgotten to do something yesterday and planned to get his assistant to call Los Angeles. Without thinking, he opened the door. Carolyn had never had the experience of waking a man up. How would she have thought that Eric would run over to open the door for her in just a pair of boxers? The girl was originally a little petite. After opening the door, her gaze first fell on Eric's muscular upper body. Then, she let out a cry and turned around, her hands unconsciously covering her burning hot face. Eric, who was originally in a daze, was awakened by the girl's tender cry. Seeing Carolyn covering her face with her hands, he couldn't help but laugh. Turning around, he picked up his clothes and put them on. He teased, "Running over so early in the morning to take advantage of me. AI. This time I've suffered a big loss. I just don't know if I can earn it back." Carolyn gently stamped her feet. Even though she knew that Eric was joking, she couldn't help but defend herself. I just came here to deliver the newspaper to you." Hearing the trembling in Carolyn's voice, Eric knew that this girl was shy and did not dare to continue teasing her. He quickly put on his clothes and said, "Okay, you can turn around now." Carolyn originally wanted to run away, but she knew that her face was definitely covered with a layer of red cloth. If she were to be seen by others like this, they would definitely laugh at her. Therefore, she resisted the urge to run away. However, when she heard Eric's words, the girl was unwilling to turn around. Her back was still facing Eric as she said, "Go wash up first, Mr. Eric. I'll help you call for breakfast." "Okay, thank you." Eric didn't refuse and walked into the bathroom. More than 10 minutes later, Eric walked out of the bedroom again. Carolyn's figure had already disappeared without a trace. Eric smiled and shook his head, feeling a little emotional. It was impossible to find such a simple and shy girl in Hollywood. After coming to Europe again, Eric made a phone call to London according to their original agreement. He didn't expect Carolyn to rush over on the same day. Of course, Eric understood the girl's feelings for him. However, the more he understood Carolyn's pure and innocent character, the more Eric felt that perhaps he should let the girl continue on her original path of life. The Vanity Fair of Hollywood was definitely not suitable for such a simple-minded girl. Bringing her in would only bring her harm. As he thought about these things, Eric thought that Carolyn didn't help him call for breakfast. Just as he was about to pick up the phone and call the restaurant to send some breakfast over, the hotel's waiter rang the doorbell. The German premiere of Jurassic Park had been held a few days ago, but the Paris premiere was on July 14th. Eric was still touring the corners of Berlin during the day, and he couldn't avoid all kinds of invitations at night. Germany was the most developed country in Europe, and its economic strength was once on par with Japan's after the war. If it weren't for the influence of the Cold War, Germany's economic strength would definitely not be much worse than Japan's, the world's second-largest economy. However, even so, Germany's national strength was still the strongest in Europe in this era. Its GNP was even comparable to the sum of Britain and France, which were ranked second and third in Europe. The development of the economy also meant that they had a lot of money in their hands. Although the Germans didn't lack a sense of security like the Japanese, they were also very keen on investing abroad. Because of the stimulation of special tax policies and the rapid development of Hollywood, investing in Hollywood movies was currently one of the most popular ways to invest in Germany. In order to stimulate the development of movies, the German government stipulated that the Germans didn't have to pay taxes on the funds invested in movies, and Germany's personal income tax was as high as 51%. In other words, if you earned $1 million a year, if you didn't invest it, you would have to pay $510,000 in personal income tax. But if you invested this money into movie production, this $1 million wouldn't have to pay any personal income tax, which was equivalent to the investor investing $510,000 in taxes. And if this $1 million was doubled in profits from the movie and became $2 million USD, then after paying the personal income tax, the remaining money was basically exempted from the original personal income tax. Moreover, even if this fund didn't double and only earned a small part of it, it was equivalent to being exempted from a part of the tax to a certain extent. With this idea, although the risk of movie investment was very high, there were still many German investors who dauntlessly threw large amounts of money into Hollywood. The two movies that Carlock Pictures failed miserably this summer, The Bear Peak and The Last Action Hero, most of the production funds came from German film funds. Strictly speaking, Firefly's Jurassic Park increased the loss of these two big productions to a certain extent. Schwarzenegger's recent action hero was basically crushed by Jurassic Park. However, when Eric arrived in Berlin, he was still eagerly pursued by many German film companies and film funds. After experiencing the failure of The Bear Peak and The Last Action Hero, the Germans had also learned to be smarter. They understood that it wasn't safe to simply invite big stars to make blockbusters. Finding the right investment target was the safest. Now that Jurassic Park was crazily breaking box office records around the world, Firefly Pictures was definitely the most suitable investment target. During Eric's days in Berlin, most of the invitations he received were from some lobbyists from German film foundations. At the same time, he also began to consider this problem. At present, the average budget of a major Hollywood film company was still about $30 million per movie, and the publicity budget was not too high. With the average production of 20 movies per year, the required production funds could be easily digested by Firefly's internal cash flow. At present, Firefly Pictures rarely brought in external film production funds. However, with the arrival of the era of big-budget movies, the total publicity budget for each movie in the future was likely to easily exceed $100 million. Although Eric was still very confident that Firefly could also withstand such a huge demand at that time, it was not cost-effective to do so. With Eric's understanding of Hollywood over the years, he understood that Hollywood's biggest advantage was to use other people's money to make movies and earn their own profits. Because of the high risk of film investment, in general, Hollywood's external investors did not make as much money as imagined. The funds invested in Hollywood could generate a profit of 10% to 15% per year, which could be considered a very generous return. Of course, because other film companies did not have Eric's golden finger, film investment always had losses and profits. Therefore, they could rely on Hollywood's ingenious internal sharing rules to keep most of the profits for themselves and transfer more of the losses to external investors. However, this rule was not so useful for Firefly. Other people were gambling when they made movies, but Eric, who could see through the dice, was not. Take the recent Jurassic Park as an example. If you brought an external investment for a movie with a global box office of $1 billion USD, and you told the investors that the business did not make money at the final settlement, it would be strange if the investors did not make a fuss. After all, most of Hollywood's movies now introduced a project operating mechanism of many investors' co-production in order to reduce the investment risk. However, for Firefly, this risk was much smaller in front of Eric. It was completely within Firefly's scope of tolerance. At this time, according to Hollywood's rules, it was not sharing the risk, but sharing the profits. Until breakfast was over, Eric still did not figure out a more feasible operation plan, and the simple breakfast was already past 9 o'clock. Today happened to be Monday. The box office of Jurassic Park for the new weekend did not exceed the forecast of Firefly's statistics department, and Collision performed much better than Eric expected, earning more than $47 million at the North American box office. It was expected that the box office for the first week would exceed $70 million, directly reaching the cost line. The total box office for Pixar's 3D animated film, The Bug Crisis, also exceeded $100 million in North America. When he was about to finish reading the newspaper in his hand, the doorbell rang again. Eric opened the door. This time it was Alan. "You came just in time. A few days ago, I asked Disney to collect information on some potential computer animation studios. Take some time today to ask them for me and see how they're preparing. If they're ready, send me a copy of the information." "I know. Is there anything else?" Alan nodded and wrote it down. Eric shook his head and suddenly said, "Also, don't let Carolyn do this kind of thing. She's too shy." It was a little awkward just now. Alan seemed to know something. He smiled a little and said, "I'm sorry, Eric. I didn't think that much. By the way, why are you here?" "Miss Wilson asked me to ask you if you're going out to play today." Alan's face became more teasing. Eric looked at his watch and nodded. "Okay, I'll go over now." "She's waiting for you downstairs," Alan said one last time and turned to leave. Eric had already decided on his itinerary for the day. He decided to go to the Museum Island in Berlin to take a look. He went back to his bedroom and changed into a pair of shoes. After tidying up a little, Eric walked out of the room. Carolyn, who was sitting in the lobby of the hotel downstairs and flipping through a magazine, looked normal. However, when she saw Eric appear, the girl couldn't help but blush. It made Eric have the urge to pinch her cheeks. To be honest, this thought had been in his mind more than once. "Let's go." Although the thought in his mind was very evil, Eric didn't show it. After politely greeting the girl, he led her out. At this time, Berlin wasn't very prosperous. Because of the Cold War, most of Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the capital of Germany was moved to Bonn in the west. However, after the merger of East and West Germany in 1990, everyone unanimously decided to move the capital back to Berlin. With the strong economic strength of West Germany, the infrastructure of Berlin was built very quickly. The public transportation system in Berlin was very developed, or rather, the public transportation system in the whole of Germany was very developed. Neither of them drove. They walked side by side to the subway station. Eric only brought 2 bodyguards with him. Soon, they took the subway to Berlin's famous Museum Island. The name Museum Island sounded very strange. In fact, it was a group of museums formed by the Berlin Museum, the National Gallery, and several other museums. Eric wasn't very interested in German culture. To be honest, because of the long period of turmoil in Europe, Germany really didn't have any culture to show. In fact, many people could find that whether it was the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Greece, or other countries, most people could talk about a series of cultures and tourist attractions with relish. However, Germany was an exception. If you mentioned Germany to people around you, their first reaction might be Hitler. This wasn't a glorious history. Although Carolyn's personality was abnormally shy, the girl's knowledge could be described as profound. Many things that museum lecturers didn't necessarily know, she could often mention easily. Eric curiously asked about this matter, and the girl's answer didn't surprise him. Eric could only sigh and be envious. Although he had inherited all the memories of his previous life, after his rebirth, Eric didn't have the ability to remember everything he saw. As time passed, some of the originally clear memories of his previous life gradually began to dissipate. Chapter 539. After spending a day visiting the museums on Berlin Museum Island, the two of them finally walked out of the History Museum at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Carolyn was still in high spirits. The two of them walked to the side of the street, and the girl pointed to the west. "The Brandenburg Gate is just ahead. It's only 1 kilometer away. Eric, do you want to take a look? That's Germany's Arc de Triomphe." "Okay." Eric nodded. Since it was so close, there was no need to take a car. Eric walked along the street towards the destination. Carolyn walked to Eric's right. She glanced at Eric's side profile from the corner of her eyes, then quickly looked away like a thief. Her little head spun a few times before she found a topic to talk about. Eric, after looking at the museum for a whole day, do you have any inspiration for a movie? Sensing the girl's clumsy conversation, Eric smiled and nodded. Yes. Carolyn moved closer and looked up at Eric. Then, can you tell me about it? Of course, Carolyn. Have you ever thought about a possibility? If the exhibits in the museum suddenly came to life, what would happen if they all came to life? I haven't thought about it. The girl shook her head honestly. Eric laughed. Then what do you think of when you look at the exhibits? Their age, their artistic value, or the historical events involved? As she spoke, the girl couldn't help but lower her head and murmured, Eric, am I very useless? I only know how to remember things from books. Of course not, Carolyn. You don't know how amazing you are. I envy your little head. As Eric spoke, he raised his arm slightly and wanted to pat the girl's head. However, considering the girl's shy personality, he gave up on this action. Noticing Eric's actions, Carolyn shrunk her neck slightly. She couldn't help but feel a little hopeful in her heart. However, when she saw Eric retract his hand, she couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. But actually, I know that they often say that I'm a bookworm behind my back. Eric stopped in his tracks and turned around to look at the petite girl before him. Solemnly, he said, Carolyn, you mustn't think that way. Those people who are talking about you are definitely jealous. Excellent memory is a gift given to you by God. The more knowledge a person has, the easier it is to draw inferences and do things that ordinary people can't do. Carolyn's eyes sparkled as she looked at Eric. After he finished speaking, she nodded her head vigorously like a student being praised by her teacher. Thank you, Eric. Eric imitated the girl's slightly raised British aristocratic accent. You're welcome, Caroline. Hee, Carolyn laughed. All right, what about the inspiration you mentioned just now? Oh, it's like this. We can create a scenario where the male lead finds a new job as a night watchman at the Natural History Museum. On his first night of duty, when he is patrolling the eerily empty museum, he suddenly hears a strange sound. Eric briefly explained the main storyline of Night at the Museum. Before he finished, he realized that the girl beside him was looking at him with a little adoration in her eyes. Eric was even certain that if he were to buy a lollipop and pass it to her now, this girl with a Lolita aura would immediately follow him home. How evil. Eric, what's next? Carolyn asked when she saw that Eric had suddenly stopped narrating the story. Eric shook his head. He didn't want to continue trying to impress Carolyn. I haven't thought of what's next. You know, the script isn't that easy to write. Carolyn instinctively defended Eric. It's okay. It's already very impressive. I definitely wouldn't have thought of such a fun story. I think that if it were to be made into a movie, it wouldn't be much worse than Jurassic Park. I hope so. Eric smiled. Carolyn was a little dissatisfied with Eric's perfunctory tone. She nodded her head firmly. That's for sure. The Brandenburg Gate was one of the more famous scenic spots in Berlin. There were many tourists around it. The two of them came to the nearby Paris Square. To avoid being surrounded by people, Eric quickly put on his sunglasses. Carolyn also took out a pair of sunglasses from her handbag. After thinking for a while, she put it back. The girl felt that there was no need for her to do so. If it weren't for the paparazzi who occasionally took a few photos of the two of them, Eric wouldn't even have to wear his sunglasses. After all, he had been working behind the scenes for a long time. Although he often appeared in the media, most of the photos were edited and were very different from the real person. The paparazzi also formed a tacit understanding with the two of them. Eric's bodyguards didn't stop them from taking photos. These people also didn't rashly stop the two of them and ask questions. After walking around the Brandenburg Gate, the two of them were tired. They sat down on the benches near the fountains on both sides of the Paris Square. You must be tired. I'll get someone to inform the hotel to send a car to pick us up. After walking for so long, Carolyn, whose face was already a little rosy, nodded. She looked at Eric and waved a few words to the bodyguards nearby. When the bodyguard stopped paying attention, she said, "Eric, before I came, Rachel asked me to ask about the movie you promised her last time." The timing last time was a little too good. Eric didn't intend to hide it and said, "It's a story about the Titanic." The Titanic? Carolyn asked with her eyes wide open. Eric nodded. "Yes, it's the Titanic that sank on its first voyage in 1912. I think Rachel's temperament is very suitable for the image of the female lead. The main body of the movie is a love story in a disaster. The female lead, Rose, who was born a noble lady, was forced by her mother to marry an American entrepreneur. In the process of going to America to get married, Rose met the very talented Jack on the Titanic. Because of a series of events, they quickly fell deeply in love with each other. As Carolyn listened to Eric's story, a sense of déjà vu arose in her mind. She asked, "Then, did the two of them end up together in the end?" Eric looked at the hopeful girl and shook his head. Carolyn bit her lower lip and couldn't help but whisper, "Why can't they be together?" "Because this is reality. In fact, Jack and Rose aren't suitable for each other. They don't belong in the same world. Although impulsive love is beautiful, it can't withstand the hardships of a dull life. Therefore, in the final setting of the story, Jack sank into the sea, but lived forever in Rose's memory. Rose also found her own belonging. A girl's thoughts were always delicate and sensitive. When Carolyn heard Eric's words, she realized that Eric seemed to be indirectly rejecting her. A strong sense of loss and bitterness uncontrollably welled up in her heart. After a while, she felt that she might have misunderstood. After all, the people around her had said more than once that she was extremely clumsy in this aspect. Thinking of this, Carolyn once again summoned some courage. Raising her head to look at Eric beside her, she said, "Eric, in fact, there's still something I haven't told you." "Oh?" Carolyn gently twisted her fingers and said in a low voice, "My father asked me to invite you to my house as a guest." "There's no need." Eric looked at the delicate and pitiful appearance of the girl and carefully considered his words. "Carolyn, I'm sure you've seen some information about me in the newspapers." Carolyn immediately shook her head. "I don't believe it." "Eric, they're definitely talking nonsense. You're a very good person. I've personally experienced it. I know that I'm a little clumsy in this aspect, but I believe in my feelings." In the end, Eric couldn't hold back anymore. Reaching out, he pinched Carolyn's cheeks. Looking at the blushing appearance of the girl, he said, "Silly girl. In fact, a lot of what they're saying is true." Carolyn was originally still somewhat shy. However, when she heard Eric's words, she suddenly stood up, her eyes wide open. "I don't believe it. You're definitely lying to me." In her agitation, the girl's voice couldn't help but become a little louder. Quite a few people in the surroundings looked over, and the paparazzi who discovered the situation raised their cameras one after another. Eric didn't want to be surrounded by people. At this moment, he couldn't care about anything else. Standing up, he pulled Carolyn towards another direction. The instant Eric held her small hand, the girl's imposing manner immediately disappeared. Obediently, she followed Eric towards the 17th of June Street in the west. The car sent by the hotel quickly arrived. Eric brought the girl into the car before opening his mouth once more. "Carolyn, thank you for accompanying me during this period. Being with you always makes people happy. However, I think you should return to London and return to your own life." When Carolyn thought of her previous loss of self-control, she felt both disappointed and sad. At this moment, when she heard Eric chasing her away, she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. Patter, patter, patter. When she felt Eric hand over a tissue, she didn't take it. Instead, she moved to the other side of the car, as though she wanted to draw a clear line between herself and Eric. The car quickly arrived at the hotel's parking lot. Eric instructed the driver to leave and sat in the car with Carolyn for a while. After confirming that the girl's emotions had calmed down, he brought her to the hotel. When they were about to reach the hotel's lobby, Carolyn gently tugged at Eric's lapel. When he stopped, she said in a low voice, "Eric, I'm really sorry. I lost myself a little just now. I'll return to London tonight. Eric took out a tissue and helped Carolyn wipe the tears on her face. This time, the girl didn't refuse. However, her face still quickly turned red. When Eric withdrew his hand, she said in a soft voice, "Thank you." Eric sighed softly and said, "It's too late today. I'll get someone to send you back tomorrow." "Thank you," Carolyn said in a low voice again. The two of them fell into silence once more. When Eric walked into the hotel's lobby, the girl who was originally sitting on the sofa in the lounge area immediately stood up to welcome him. The girl had a head of blonde hair, a tall figure, and exquisite curves. It was Claudia Schiffer, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. Eric. Claudia arrived in front of Eric and glanced at the petite girl beside him. She somewhat hesitantly slowed down her footsteps. She originally wanted to extend her hand to shake Eric's hand, but she saw that Eric had taken the initiative to extend his arms to her. The girl didn't hesitate and threw herself into Eric's embrace, kissing his cheek intimately. Eric knew that Claudia was German. However, he hadn't paid attention to the girl's whereabouts for a while. Thus, he was a little surprised to meet her in Berlin. "This is Carolyn Wilson from London. Carolyn, this is Claudia Schiffer. I'm sure you've seen her in a movie before." Eric let go of the girl's slender waist and introduced the two girls to each other. Claudia looked at Carolyn suspiciously. The girl's expression was somewhat delicate and pitiful, but there was some hostility in her eyes. However, Claudia still extended her hand warmly to the girl. "Hello, Miss Wilson." "Hello, Miss Schiffer." Carolyn instinctively shook Claudia's hand out of etiquette that had been cultivated for a long time. However, after greeting her, the girl quickly released her hand and turned to Eric. "Eric, I'll go back to my room first." "Okay, see you tomorrow." Carolyn walked towards the elevator. The moment the elevator door closed, she saw that Eric had already intimately wrapped his arm around Claudia's waist and was walking towards the hotel restaurant. The girl bit her lips and lightly stomped her feet. "You did it on purpose. You must have done it on purpose. You bad guy." In the hotel restaurant, Eric and Claudia chose a window seat and sat down. He then asked, "Why are you in Berlin?" "I'm German. Is it strange to be in Berlin?" Claudia replied with a smile. However, she quickly explained, "I received an invitation to work with a brand, so I came over to participate in some activities." "A car brand?" Claudia rolled her eyes at him. "Do cars only exist in Germany?" "In my opinion, that's the case." Eric smiled and continued, "You just happened to come over. I don't speak German. Accompany me to a cocktail party tonight. It's organized by Kong Stan Ding Film. Maybe it will bring you some good opportunities." "Okay, but I still have 2 movie contracts. I still feel that it was easier when I was a model. I've already acted in a few movies, but every time before the movie was released, they would mock me for being a vase. Please, I've already admitted it. I'm a vase. Can't they change the way they call me? Although you're so beautiful, if you want to seek a breakthrough, you can try to dress up ugly and act in a few movies." Claudia shook her head and refused. "I'm not looking forward to winning an Oscar. I'll just be a vase. I just want to appear on screen beautifully." At this time, the waiter came over. As there was a party in the evening, the two of them did not order anything to eat. They only ordered 2 cups of coffee and continued chatting. Chapter 540. Her first love that she had been looking forward to had come to an end before it had even started. The sad girl couldn't rest for the entire night. Only when the sun had risen did Carolyn pack her luggage and leave her room. She had originally planned to leave quietly, since he might not care about her anyway. The corridor of the hotel was empty. The left led to the elevator, and the right led to Eric's room. She looked around and hesitated. In the end, she couldn't resist the anticipation in her heart and even found a reasonable excuse for herself. Leaving without saying goodbye was too rude for the upbringing she had received since she was young. Arriving at Eric's door, Carolyn pressed the doorbell and waited quietly. She quickly thought about what she should say later. Perhaps he would ask her to stay again. If that was the case, she would forgive him for what he had said yesterday. She had always thought of herself as a very forgiving girl, not to mention that she liked him so much. Then the door opened, and the tall blonde girl from yesterday afternoon appeared in front of her. The girl was wearing a simple pink silk pajamas, and the Yuehun tribe's props showed that she was not wearing anything else underneath. Two smooth and round long legs were exposed, and anyone could tell that she must have stayed here last night. "Good morning, Miss Wilson. Eric happened to be in the shower. What can I do for you?" Claudia turned to the side and politely gestured for Carolyn to come in. She didn't show any other reaction because of the girl's weak aura. She was a very smart woman and would never take the initiative to ask about the other women by Eric's side. Carolyn stood in front of Claudia, who was much taller than her, and shrunk her neck back in self-abasement. Suppressing the sourness in her heart, she gently sniffled and said in a low voice, "Miss Heaver, I'm only here to say goodbye to Eric. Please tell him that I'm returning to London." After the girl finished speaking, she didn't wait for Claudia's reply and walked towards the elevator in a panic. Claudia looked at the girl's dispirited figure and walked back to the guest room. She knocked on the bathroom door and told Eric what had just happened. Carolyn walked out of the hotel and was about to hail a taxi when she heard a voice calling out to her from behind. Turning her head, she saw Eric chasing after her. Eric came to the girl's side and stood still. Only then did he heave a sigh of relief. He buttoned up the last two buttons of his shirt and said, "Carolyn, I'll send you to the airport later. I'm worried about you being alone." When the girl heard Eric's words, she was a little touched at first, but she immediately turned her back in a huff. "No need, Eric, you should go back and accompany Miss Heaver. I can go back by myself." Eric buttoned up his shirt and ignored Carolyn's words. He took the girl's small luggage bag and said, "Let's go. I'll get someone to buy a plane ticket for you. Right now, it's best if you eat breakfast first. It won't do if you don't." After Eric finished speaking, he saw that Carolyn was still pursing her thin pink lips and not moving. He had no choice but to use his trump card. He reached out and grabbed the girl's small hand and walked into the hotel. The moment Eric's warm and rough hand grabbed her, the resistance in Carolyn's heart disappeared completely. She lowered her small head, her face red, and quietly followed beside Eric like an obedient child. After breakfast, Eric took Carolyn to Berlin's Schönefeld Airport in the hotel's car. He helped the girl get her ticket and even contacted Rachel, who was in London, to pick her up at the airport. He accompanied the girl all the way until the flight to London began to board. Only then did Eric feel at ease as he watched Carolyn walk into the boarding gate. When she heard the door open, Claudia, who was leaning against the sofa in the living room and watching television, propped herself up and leaned against the back of the sofa. She looked at Eric and asked, "Send her away?" Eric nodded slightly and walked over to the girl's slender waist and leaned against the sofa. Claudia felt that Eric was a little disappointed. She couldn't help but ask, "Since you also like her, why did you let her leave?" "Because I'm a good person." Eric shook his head self-mockingly. Seeing the girl in his arms rolling her eyes, he asked, "Do you know who she is?" "How could I not know? She's the only daughter of Berkshire's Earl Wilson. I heard about it when I was in Hollywood last month. The newspapers were all saying that you were planning to marry her. When I came over yesterday, I was afraid that you would drive me away because I was a commoner." Eric gently pinched Claudia's soft waist. "Okay, stop teasing me. Have you eaten breakfast?" "Of course." Claudia giggled and rubbed against Eric's arms. "You're going out to play today. I can also be your tour guide." Eric didn't have any qualms about bringing another girl to appear in public right after sending Carolyn away. However, if they appeared in the newspapers, it would definitely embarrass Carolyn and her family. Eric originally wanted to refuse, but after thinking about it, he took out a travel album from a pile of magazines under the coffee table. After flipping through it for a while, he said, "Let's go to other cities. This way we can get rid of the paparazzi. How about Prague?" Claudia also moved her head over. Prague was the capital of the Czech Republic and was only 200 kilometers away from Berlin. However, the girl shook her head and said, "We need to apply for a visa to go to Prague. Although it's very fast to apply for a tourist visa, we definitely can't go there today." Eric also reacted. The European Union had only been established for 2 years and only had 6 member states. After swiping his finger on the map for a while, Eric picked the Netherlands, which was also a member of the European Union. Then let's go to Amsterdam. Okay, I'll go change my clothes and give my agent a call. He's in Paris right now to help me negotiate an endorsement contract. Claudia stood up and walked towards the bedroom. Eric quickly flipped through the travel album and also walked into the bedroom. Claudia had already changed her clothes and was standing beside the desk. She took out her mobile phone and address book from her Chanel bag and looked for numbers. Eric casually glanced at Claudia and was about to walk towards the wardrobe when his gaze was attracted by the mobile phone in her hand. Claudia had just found her agent's temporary number and was about to call him when she felt Eric behind her. He reached out his hand and took away her mobile phone before hugging her waist. Claudia thought that Eric was suddenly interested and turned her head to glare at him. Just as she was about to take the initiative to lie on the big desk, she realized that Eric was carefully playing with her mobile phone. Claudia blushed at her thoughts and turned to face Eric. "Is there a problem?" Eric held the mobile phone in his hand and apologetically kissed Claudia's curved lips. "Sorry, baby, we might not be able to go to Amsterdam. But maybe in a few days, I can take you to Finland." "What?" Claudia asked in confusion. Eric pointed at the eye-catching Nokia logo on the mobile phone. "This mobile phone is from Finland." Claudia still had a confused expression, but Eric was a little excited. He had always been thinking about Apple, but he had neglected the fact that Nokia had dominated more than 40% of the global mobile phone market before Apple's mobile phone appeared. It was also a giant with a market value of more than $200 billion. Moreover, in the original space-time, Apple had only started to rise slowly in 2007. It was too far away from the present. However, Nokia's rapid development was something that would happen in the next few years. If he could intervene now, it would be another huge fortune. Rachel was sitting in the departure lounge of Heathrow Airport, listening helplessly to the chatter of a person who was trying to strike up a conversation with her. She stared at the entrance not far away until a familiar figure appeared in her field of vision. Rachel heaved a sigh of relief, stood up, and said to the young man beside her, "I'm sorry, Mr. Luke, my girlfriend is back." Rachel deliberately emphasized the word, girlfriend. After saying that, she ignored the surprised expression of the young man and walked straight to Carolyn. After approaching her, Rachel discovered that Carolyn was different. The girl's white and delicate face did not have the slightest bit of liveliness. Her thin lips were pursed into a line and her eyelashes were drooping. Her beautiful golden hair, which was originally fluffy and slightly curly, was drooping softly. Every strand of her hair looked so listless. Her small figure floated in the crowd, giving people the feeling that she was a pitiful kitten that had been abandoned by its owner and drenched in the rain. "Carolyn, what's wrong?" Rachel quickened her pace and asked with concern. When Carolyn raised her head and saw that it was Rachel, her pursed lips immediately collapsed. Her eyes were red as she threw herself into Rachel's embrace. "Woo-woo, woo-woo. Rachel, he rejected me." Rachel, who had thought that something big had happened, breathed a sigh of relief in her heart when she heard Carolyn's words. However, she also knew that this was definitely a huge blow to this little lass who had just experienced her first awakening of love. Therefore, Rachel hugged the girl tightly and patted her back to comfort her. "Okay, don't cry. I've already told you that Eric Williams is a playboy. You were originally... Woo-woo, he's not." The girl sobbed as she retorted. Rachel felt somewhat helpless, but could only go along with the lass in her embrace. "Okay, he's not. Woo-woo, he's a bad guy." The girl quickly sobbed again. "Yes, he's a bad guy," Rachel said in agreement. Carolyn leaned into Rachel's embrace and cried for a long time before she finally stopped sobbing. She softly said, "Rachel, I miss Mommy." Rachel helped the girl wipe her face and hung her backpack on her shoulder. She took Carolyn's small hand and walked out. "Let's go. I'll take you home." Carolyn obediently followed behind Rachel. When the two of them left the airport hall, she suddenly muttered, "He held my hand." Rachel took out her keys and opened the door of her large Jaguar Monarch. She stuffed the girl into the passenger seat and said, "I know. The Daily Mail published the photo today." Carolyn looked at Rachel somewhat nervously. "Then what did they say?" "Who cares what they do? The Daily Mail is just a tabloid that likes to spout nonsense." As Rachel spoke, she started the car and turned into the highway. Carolyn saw that she was about to step on the accelerator out of habit. She didn't have time to ask and hurriedly fastened her seatbelt. "Rachel, can you drive slower? It's too dangerous." "Okay, darling. I'll listen to you today." Rachel lowered the car's speed. She had visited Carolyn's family's manor a few times before, so she didn't need the girl to give her directions. After leaving the airport area, she drove along the highway and headed northwest. After the car stabilized, Rachel carefully probed, "Do you feel better? Do you want to tell me what happened?" After a moment of silence, Carolyn softly said, "He suddenly said yesterday that we're not suitable for each other." Rachel saw that the girl didn't say anything else after throwing out such a sentence. She couldn't help but sigh in her heart and didn't ask anything else. She knew that Carolyn still had a deep affection for Eric. At this time, she was definitely hiding something for him. However, Rachel also knew that although this girl had a weak personality, she sometimes liked to go down a dead end. Once she had decided on something, even 8 cows couldn't pull her back. The Jaguar Sovereign passed by Windsor town and drove for more than 10 kilometers before arriving at Wilson Manor, which was located next to a tributary of the River Thames. When the manor's guard saw the car parked outside the gate, he went up to ask a few questions. However, he saw the window roll down, revealing his young lady's haggard little face. "Mark, it's me. Miss, you're finally back. Madam mentioned you this morning. I'll inform her now." "Oh, I'll open the door for you first." The middle-aged man named Mark respectfully greeted Carolyn. He then hurriedly opened the manor's large iron gate before walking into the security booth to pick up the phone. Although it wasn't Rachel's first time visiting this place, she still couldn't help but feel a little emotional and envious as she drove through the long corridor of Wilson Manor and looked at the large manor that was dozens of acres in front of her. The British aristocracy had long declined. The cost of maintaining traditional aristocratic manors and castles was extremely high. Because of the 75% inheritance tax in the United Kingdom, most of the economically weak aristocrats found it difficult to maintain their ancestral businesses. They had no choice but to donate a large number of manors and castles, or simply abandon them. Earl Wilson's family was one of the few aristocratic families in the United Kingdom that was still thriving. The car stopped at the side of the road. Before Rachel could get out of the car, she saw a graceful woman walking out of the castle with a few maids. Seeing her mother's figure, Carolyn hurriedly jumped out of the car and ran towards the woman. Rachel got out of the car and opened the back door. Just as she took out Carolyn's luggage, a maid came over and took the bag. At this time, Mrs. Wilson also came over with her daughter. She stretched out her hand to Rachel and said, "Miss Wasey, thank you for taking care of Carolyn during this time." "You're welcome, Mrs. Wilson. Carolyn is my good friend, so this is what I should do," Rachel replied politely. The reverence that the British people had for aristocrats was deeply engraved in their bones. The reason why Rachel was able to get along well with Carolyn was mainly due to the girl's pure personality concealing the distance brought about by the aristocratic manners she had cultivated since she was young. However, Rachel still felt somewhat restrained when facing Mrs. Wilson. She could not wait to leave. "Madam, since Carolyn has safely returned home, I think I should return to London. I still have some matters to attend to in the afternoon. If it's not something important, stay for lunch." Mrs. Wilson still had a gentle smile on her face. She even gently gestured for Rachel to leave. Carolyn directly stepped forward and pulled Rachel. "Stay, Rachel. We talked on the phone the night before yesterday. I know you definitely have nothing to do in the afternoon." Rachel was exposed on the spot. Her cheeks were slightly hot. She really wanted to reach out and pinch this silly girl's face. Looking at Mrs. Wilson, whose smile didn't change at all, Rachel could only nod slightly. "Then I'll bother you." Hearing Rachel agree, Carolyn couldn't wait to pull her to the castle. At this time Mrs. Wilson, who was following her daughter, said, "Carolyn, go and say hello to your father first. He's in the study." "I know, Mother." "Also, Matthew and Robert will be back for lunch at noon. The little guy will also come over." Carolyn asked in surprise, "What about Charles?" "He went to New York a week ago." Mrs. Wilson looked at her daughter dotingly. "You're too incompetent as a sister. You don't even know your brother's whereabouts." Carolyn stuck out her tongue playfully. However, she quickly retracted it under Mrs. Wilson's glare. Rachel, who was following them, only felt her scalp go numb. Due to Carolyn's talkative nature, she knew the situation of the Wilson family very well. The current Earl, James Wilson, had 3 sons and 1 daughter. The 3 sons happened to be the 3 people mentioned by the mother and daughter just now. Carolyn was the youngest child in the family. Although the Countess Edith Wilson looked like she was in her 40s, her actual age was much older because she took good care of herself. Her eldest son, Matthew, and second son, Robert, were already married and had children. Only Charles, who was 4 years older than Carolyn, was still single. However, it was said that he was already engaged. Listening to the conversation between the mother and daughter, Rachel guessed that almost everyone in this big family would be gathered at noon. Thinking of this, the uneasiness in Rachel's heart grew stronger. And reality proved that her bad feeling in her heart was not wrong at all. As noon came, more and more people came to Earl Wilson's castle. The 2 sons of the owner brought their wives and children, as well as a few other guests. This made Rachel feel a strong sense of escape. Fortunately, the considerate Mrs. Wilson seemed to have sensed Rachel's emotions. After lunch, she whispered a few words to her daughter. Only then did Carolyn bring Rachel back to her room. Chapter 541. After entering Carolyn's room, Rachel finally didn't have to pretend to be a lady anymore. Heaving a long sigh of relief, she threw herself onto the large bed in the girl's bedroom without a care for her image. She was only glad that she was wearing a long dress today. If she was wearing the loose sweater and washed jeans that she usually wore, she would probably feel uncomfortable sitting next to a room full of serious or pretending to be serious aristocrats. Carolyn didn't care about Rachel's carefree appearance on her bed. Instead, she was somewhat envious of her carefree behavior. The girl moved the small stool beside the dressing table over and leaned on the edge of the bed. Propping her chin up with her little hand, she looked at Rachel. "Rachel, are you still hungry? I saw that you only ate a little. You usually don't eat so little." Rachel turned over and faced Carolyn. Stretching out her hand, she pinched the girl's face. "You little troublemaker. I want to hurry back to London right now." Carolyn's expression immediately became somewhat perturbed. "Is there something that our family isn't good enough?" "Of course not," Rachel hurriedly denied. "I just feel that we don't belong to the same world. I feel more free in my own world." Hearing Rachel's words, Carolyn was stunned for a moment. Her long eyelashes fluttered a few times, a layer of mist appearing in her sparkling eyes. Sparkling and translucent teardrops dripped down. Seeing this, Rachel immediately panicked. She hurriedly sat up and leaned over. "What's wrong, Carolyn? Don't cry. I was just—" Carolyn once again revealed the expression of an injured kitten as she leaned into Rachel's embrace. Perhaps because they were at home, the girl didn't cry out loud. Sobbing, she said, "No. No. Rachel. It's just that when he rejected me yesterday, he said the same thing. I just don't understand. What's wrong?" Rachel gently stroked the girl's back. Carolyn cried for a while at the airport. After returning to the manor, she seemed to have returned to her carefree state. Rachel initially thought that she had recovered from being rejected by Eric Williams. She didn't expect that the girl had only hidden her feelings in her heart. Furthermore, she hid them so shallowly that she couldn't bear to be touched at all. "Carolyn, don't cry. Tell me what exactly happened yesterday. You're so stupid, so you must have misunderstood. I'll help you analyze it." This time, the girl didn't hide anything. She told Rachel about what had happened the day before. Yesterday, we went to the Berlin Museum Island and the Brandenburg Gate. I asked him about the movie for you, and he said it was Titanic. He told me the plot of the movie. He said Jack and Rose were not from the same world, and it was more suitable for them to have a good memory instead of being together for a long time. Then he told me to go back to my life. And that woman. She was very beautiful, prettier than me. After Carolyn finished stuttering, Rachel helped the girl tidy up her messy bangs and said, I feel that Eric Williams thinks that you're too naive and that you're not suitable for the Hollywood environment. That's why he rejected you. You know, Hollywood is very chaotic. But I feel that Eric, well, let's just say that he's a gentleman. That's why he didn't continue to lie to a silly girl like you. So, forget about him. Maybe you can go back to Cambridge in advance. Don't think about him anymore. Just treat him as a passerby in your life. Do you remember when we went to see Eric Williams' movie, Back to 17, in our first year of university? I think there's a line that's very good. When a girl is young, she always has to experience a few bastards. Carolyn immediately interrupted Rachel. He's not a bastard. Rachel smiled. I know. He's a bad guy. Carolyn's cheeks turned red at Rachel's teasing tone. But Rachel, I just like him. Who hasn't liked someone before? Actually, I secretly liked Marlon Brando. It's a pity that he's already an old man now. You clearly know that what we're talking about is different. In essence, there's no difference. So, you should try your best to forget this matter. Maybe you can go back to Cambridge in advance. Like many times, you can dive into the library and take out a few books. Before you know it, a day will pass. Maybe you'll wake up one day and forget about him. Then, you might feel that your reaction today was very silly. Carolyn silently listened to Rachel's words and said, Rachel, I don't want to study anymore. Why? Isn't your father no longer stopping you from continuing your graduate studies? It has nothing to do with Dad. I want to be like you and go out to work. I don't want to be a little girl who doesn't know anything anymore. Rachel couldn't help but pinch the girl's face again. I think it's better to forget about it. Carolyn could tell that Rachel didn't seem to have any expectations for her decision. She sniffled and said unhappily, I'll definitely do very well. I'll go out and look for a job tomorrow. Then you'll have to get your parents' approval first. I think that when they hear your decision, they'll probably ground you at home, Rachel said. Carolyn was a little girl who had been carefully protected in an ivory tower by her parents and brothers since she was young. She hadn't had much contact with the outside world since she was young. If such an innocent little girl were to be pushed into society, it would be no different from throwing a little sheep into a pack of wolves. Rachel believed that she could see this point. Carolyn's family definitely understood this as well. Last time, the girl had left home to pursue her studies in Cambridge. It was barely within the scope of the Wilson family's tolerance. However, if Carolyn were to speak of her decision, there was a 90% chance that she would be grounded by the Earl's family. She knew that aristocratic girls like Carolyn would generally choose to marry into aristocratic families or rich families. Then, like Mrs. Wilson, she would quietly become a housewife. This was the safest path for her. Carolyn seemed to understand the possible reaction of her family. She suddenly felt somewhat disappointed. She tightened her grip on Rachel's arm and suddenly said, Rachel, can you stay with me today? No, you're already 22 years old. You're not 2 years old, Rachel hurriedly refused. But if you're not here, Father and Mother will definitely ask me about Eric. I don't even know how to answer them. Rachel looked at Carolyn's pitiful little face and her heart immediately softened. Okay, but I'll definitely leave tomorrow morning. Then can you take me with you and leave? Even if I wanted to, you can't leave. I can hide in the trunk. I've read about this in books. Rachel couldn't help but laugh again. Then I'll be wanted by the London police for kidnapping and selling young girls. Eric, this is the financial situation of Nokia in recent years. Also, this is the list of some of Nokia's current shareholders. The most important one is the National Bank of Finland. There are also some German and French capital. Alright, I also found out today that Nokia's current CEO, Joma Alala, is not in Finland. He should be in New York. It's said that he has been there for a month because of Nokia's financing. I've called back home for the specific situation and asked someone to find out. In the hotel where Eric was staying in the center of Berlin, his suite had been turned into a temporary office. There were many documents that he had collected over the past few days placed everywhere. After seeing the latest Nokia 1011 mobile phone from Claudia, Eric quickly began to ask Alan about the company's detailed information. Nokia was an ancient company with a very long history in Finland. It started with papermaking at first. Later, it gradually ventured into the rubber, optical cable, telecommunications, television, and other industries. In the 1980s, it was one of the largest diversified companies in Finland. Of course, this giant was only for Finland, a small northern European country with a population of only 5 million. At the end of the 1980s, because it was involved in too many fields, the group's business fell into chaos. Nokia began to decline rapidly. In 1988, Nokia's CEO, Kalle Karamo, committed suicide under the pressure of Nokia's business failure. Nokia's business became worse and worse. In just a few years, it had changed several leaders. The current Nokia CEO, Joma Alala, was originally the president of Nokia's mobile phone department. After being appointed as Nokia's leader, he began to bet all of Nokia's chips on the mobile phone department. In recent years, he had spun off many of Nokia's businesses. Nokia had successfully launched a GSM mobile phone, the 1011, which was the mobile phone that Eric saw at Claudia's place a few days ago. Eric knew that the GSM network was the main mobile phone network communication system for more than 10 years, so Joma Alala's choice of direction was not wrong. However, because of the collapse of the Soviet Union a few years ago, the economy of the Soviet Union obviously collapsed. Finland, as a northern European country close to the Soviet Union, joined the Warsaw Pact camp under the coercion of the Soviet Union a few years ago. Therefore, the economic collapse of the Soviet Union, without exception, affected Finland. Finland had been in a state of economic stagnation for several years. Although the Nokia 1011 received a good market response, Nokia was still in a difficult situation because it did not have enough development funds. From the information in front of him, Eric also found that in 1991, the year before Joma Alala took office, Nokia tried to sell the mobile phone department to Ericsson in neighboring Sweden, but it was rejected by Ericsson with an almost mocking attitude. From this, it could be seen that the entire European capital market despised Nokia. Speaking of which, in the process of reading the information, Eric found another very interesting thing. Among the 3 leading mobile phone giants in the world in the 1990s, except for Motorola, the other 2 were in several small northern European countries. Nokia belonged to Finland, and Ericsson was a Swedish company. Eric also quickly found the reason. Because the small northern European countries such as Finland and Sweden had a small population, and their territory was mostly mountainous and hilly, the cost of developing wired telephone communication in these small northern European countries was extremely expensive. This also caused these northern European countries to pay more attention to the development of wireless communication. As early as 1981, when many people were still unfamiliar with mobile phones, Finland had already built a nationwide mobile phone network. Because of the emphasis on mobile communication technology, mobile phone giants such as Ericsson and Nokia were created. I have already called Chris a few times. By the way, have you sent this information back to New York? Yes, every time I organize a piece of information, I will send a copy back to New York separately. Alan nodded and suddenly said, Eric, I think if you are interested in mobile phone companies, maybe you can try to invest in Sweden's Ericsson, or invest in the local Motorola. In my opinion, the current Nokia doesn't have much investment significance. Joma Alala had to go to the United States because he couldn't find investors in Europe. Judging from the fact that he stayed in the United States for more than a month without any news, Wall Street investors don't seem to be too enthusiastic about Nokia. Eric flipped through Nokia's financial records for the past few years and said without looking up, Motorola and Ericsson are both emerging companies. These companies don't lack layman investors like us. If we get involved now, we won't get much benefit. But Nokia is different. If we invest in Nokia now, it will be like giving charcoal in the snow to this company. Oh, you should understand what I mean by giving charcoal in the snow. Alan resisted the urge to roll his eyes and nodded. Of course I know, but since the other investors are very pessimistic about this company, I think... Alan didn't continue, but Eric didn't mind and said, "You think that a layman like me definitely has no reason to intervene, right?" Alan smiled awkwardly, but nodded slightly. Claudia had been acting as Eric's temporary secretary these days, and she did it with relish. Moreover, the girl also liked how Eric looked when he was working. Listening to the conversation between the two, Claudia couldn't help but say, "Alan, actually, I don't think what you said is completely correct. I just happened to use Nokia's latest mobile phone product. When I returned to Europe, a good friend recommended it to me. She said that the call quality of this mobile phone is very good. Since ordinary people like us will choose this company's product because of the quality of a mobile phone, it means that this company must have its investment value." Chapter 542. When Alan heard Claudia's words, he just shrugged slightly. Eric, who was flipping through the information, noticed his assistant's small movement and shook his head helplessly. His move this time was indeed different from the past. When he invested in companies such as Cisco and AOL, the development prospects of these companies were relatively bright, and the funds involved were not too much. Even the 3 internet companies he invested in, such as Yahoo, only invested tens of millions. But the situation this time was very different. Nokia was a large group company in Finland. Although its development was in trouble, from the financial data collected, this starving camel still had about $1 billion in assets. From Eric's personal opinion, of course, the more shares the better. If he could swallow all of them, he didn't mind throwing in all of Firefly's funds. Eric stayed in Berlin for a few more days. He then moved to Paris with the main creative team of Jurassic Park to prepare for the movie's French premiere. At this time, it was already mid-July. Jurassic Park had been released in North America for 6 weeks, and the box office easily exceeded $300 million. Regarding the box office number curve of Jurassic Park in North America that was still strong, the local media had already gone from being amazed at breaking $100 million in the first week to now being numb. There was almost no suspense that the film's box office in North America would exceed $400 million in the next few weeks, and the discussion about whether it could exceed $500 million did not seem to be that enthusiastic. After all, whether it was $400 million or $500 million, for most Hollywood films, it was like a person looking up at the stars in the sky. Very few people would think about whether a certain star was 100 light-years or 1,000 light-years away from them. The overseas box office of Jurassic Park also exceeded $300 million in the 6th week, and the total box office reached $600 million. The box office in the UK, which was released at the same time as North America, was particularly eye-catching. The box office in the UK reached £57 million in 6 weeks, and the total box office was expected to exceed £70 million. At the same time, Jurassic Park would also be released in France, Spain, Japan, and other overseas countries. Especially Japan, this was a country obsessed with monsters. Although Eric didn't have a specific number in his memory, the box office of Jurassic Park in Japan definitely exceeded $100 million. Although Jurassic Park was crazily collecting box office around the world, creating one box office miracle after another. But this miraculous movie didn't attract a positive response from the local media in any country. In recent months, the media in many European countries used a tone close to the wolf to evaluate Jurassic Park, and this was especially true in France, where Eric was currently based. As the birthplace of film, the French had always been very proud of their country's film industry, and French film did indeed have a very glorious period. In order to welcome the box office giant Jurassic Park and defend the dignity of French film, the French released the most expensive film in French film history, Germinal, at the same time as Jurassic Park. The film adaptation of the French literary masterpiece Germinal cost 164 million francs, or about $30 million. It was jointly invested by more than 10 French film companies, and could indeed be said to be the most expensive film in France so far. Eric only had one thought in his mind regarding the reaction of the French. Why bother? Germinal was about the tragic life experiences of French miners at the end of the 19th century. It was nearly 3 hours long and could be said to be an absolutely boring film. Using such a film to compete with the entertaining Jurassic Park in box office, Eric couldn't think of a second result. Moreover, the timing was very sensitive. This year was the last year of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Negotiations. In order to establish the World Trade Organization, after many years of wrangling, North America and Europe finally reached a consensus on most of the terms. Now, the UA government was fighting for the same economic status for Hollywood films as physical products, but the European countries proposed the cultural exception argument. For this reason, some famous Hollywood directors even started a debate with European filmmakers. With Eric's current position, of course, he had to stand on the side of Hollywood. In order not to provoke the emotions of the French media, after a simple premiere, Eric cancelled most of the promotional schedule in France and sent the other main cast members to the next stop, Madrid, Spain. Anyway, Jurassic Park was already a hot topic in Europe. Reducing some of the promotional activities would not affect the French box office of Jurassic Park too much. While promoting the film, Eric had not stopped privately discussing the Nokia matter with Chris on the phone. Chris had decided to personally come to Europe with the investment team of Firefly, so Eric temporarily stayed in Paris. Compared to the resistance of the media and cultural circles to Hollywood films, the French film production and distribution companies were very eager to invest in and distribute Hollywood films. Shrewd businessmen could see that the decline of French films was irreversible. Capital chased after profits, and the French film companies certainly knew how to choose. In a hotel on the banks of the Seine in Paris, Eric sat leisurely on the balcony of the hotel. A faint steam rose from the coffee cup on the small round table beside him. From time to time, he would tap on the laptop keyboard on his lap. Occasionally, he would look up and see the tall Eiffel Tower not far away. Hearing the sound of the door, Eric looked back and saw Alan walking in with a stack of documents. Eric, the box office news for the first day of Jurassic Park and Germinal is out. Alan put the documents in his hands on the round table beside Eric, took out a copy, and handed it to him. Eric had taken advantage of the night to walk around the streets last night. The few cinemas he passed by had the scene of parties buying tickets, so he had already expected it. He was not in a hurry to open the documents Alan handed over. Instead, he took out a floppy disk from his laptop and handed it to Alan. "This is a script idea I thought of a few days ago. Send it back to Los Angeles and let them register the copyright." The script on the floppy disk was The Night at the Museum that he had thought of when he had accompanied Carolyn to visit the Berlin Museum Island. In the past few days, Eric had used his free time to roughly type out the script. Alan did not ask any more questions. He kept the floppy disk and introduced the documents that had just been sent over. Then, he took out an invitation from the folder. "This is from the CEO of Gaumont, Mr. Nicholas Seydoux. They are holding a celebration party for a movie tonight, and they would like to invite you to attend." Eric flipped open the box office data of Jurassic Park and Germinal. He frowned slightly and asked casually, "What movie?" "The movie is called Fragrant. I just checked. It's a romance movie. It was released at the beginning of June. The lead actors are two very famous French movie stars, Vincent Perez and Sophie Marceau. This movie has received a very good response in the European and Asian markets." Alan gave a simple introduction and did not mention the box office data of Fragrant. After all, compared to Jurassic Park, the box office of this romance movie was not worth mentioning. Eric still had a trace of helplessness between his eyebrows. After hearing Alan's introduction, he did not even think about it and asked casually based on his memory, "Sophie Marceau paid 1,000,000 francs in compensation to leave Gaumont back then. Didn't both parties fall out? Why are they working together again?" Alan did not know about this. Sophie Marceau's influence was more in France and the Far East. Hollywood had not noticed this French rose. "I'm not sure about this. Eric, do you want to check it out?" Eric was stunned for a moment before he reacted. He shook his head and said, "No need. I just suddenly thought of this. Sophie Marceau's past of falling out with Gaumont in order to film Zulaski's Wild Love appeared most of the time in the Female Stars magazine articles. In the end, it was just to beautify the female star's image. It was more of a publicity component. Moreover, 1 million francs was less than 200,000 USD after conversion. For a famous European female star, it was not too big of a financial burden. Sophie Marceau and Gaumont's film company might have just been unable to come to an agreement for a while. Everyone temporarily parted ways and went their own ways. There was no possibility of them not interacting for the rest of their lives. To be more realistic, now that the European film industry was in decline, there were very few companies that had the ability to produce commercial movies. This French rose did not have many choices. Then, Alan pointed at the invitation. Tonight's cocktail party? Eric shook his head. He did not know what the so-called celebration party was going to be like. During this time, the French media had already hyped up the situation of the confrontation between Germinal and Jurassic Park. If the media attended, they would definitely ask about the box office of Jurassic Park and Germinal. Sighing, Eric looked at the data in his hand again. Jurassic Park's box office in France was 6 million francs on the first day. The box office of Germinal, which was on the same scale as Jurassic Park, was only a little more than 1 million. When the time came, no matter how he answered, or even if he did not answer, as long as his figure appeared in the newspapers tomorrow, there would probably be sparks. Alan could also understand some of Eric's concerns. If that's the case, I will call and reject the other party. Also, Mr. Hansen will arrive in Paris around 10 in the morning tomorrow. I have already booked the hotel room. Eric, is there anything else you want to add? Nope, that's all. Alan nodded and turned to leave Eric's room. Just as he reached the corridor, the mobile phone on Alan's waist rang. After saying a few words, Alan pushed open the door to Eric's room again and handed the mobile phone to him. Eric, Mr. Jack Valenti is calling. Jack Valenti? Eric was a little confused. Jack Valenti was the president of the American Film Association. Eric had only seen him once at the American Film Association's annual meeting last year. He was a little confused as to why Jack Valenti would call him. However, Jack Valenti had been the president of the American Film Association since 1966. He had been in this position for nearly 30 years, and it seemed that he would continue to be in this position. The political-turned-president of the Film Association had been dedicated to the expansion of Hollywood's film industry around the world, so his position in Hollywood was very respected. Eric did not neglect and quickly took the mobile phone from Alan. The two chatted briefly and then hung up. Alan could only faintly hear that the voice coming from the phone was a little hurried, but he did not know the content. After Eric hung up the phone, he said to Alan, "Get ready. I will attend the celebration party for Fragrance, held by Gaomeng Film Company tonight." Noticing Eric's solemn look, Alan asked, "Do you want me to prepare another dress for you?" "No, the one I wore at the premiere will be fine." Eric returned the mobile phone to Alan. He was still wondering why Jack Valenti appeared. Judging from the current situation, Eric expected him to be here for the general agreement on tariffs and trade that was being negotiated. The American Film Association was not only responsible for the classification of Hollywood films, but also the spokesperson for Hollywood's interests. The negotiation of the general agreement on tariffs and trade would definitely be handled by the American Film Association. Although it also involved the interests of Firefly, Eric could not think of a reason why Jack Valenti would contact him directly. Under the night sky, the hotel's limousine slowly drove into a mansion on the banks of the Seine River in the western suburbs of Paris. As soon as Eric got out of the car, he saw a group of people greeting him enthusiastically. When Eric saw these people, he realized that this celebration party was unusual. Nicolas Seydoux of Gaomeng Film was not surprised, and Jack Valenti was also invited in advance. However, he had just met the president of German Standing Film last week, and some other familiar faces. "Eric, I'm glad you could come." Nicolas Seydoux took the lead and hugged Eric warmly. He then introduced the others to Eric one by one. Needless to say, the president of Ding Film, There was also the CEO of German New World Film, the president of French Television 4, the head of the film department of Vivendi Group. What surprised Eric even more was that even the president of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, John Carey, was here, and the current actual controller of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was French Credit Lyonnais. Generally speaking, these people were basically the heads of the top film companies in Europe. At the end of the introductions, Eric could only entertain them calmly with the thought of dealing with them as they came. "Okay, guys, give me and the little guy some time," Jack Valenti said loudly after Nicolas Seydoux finished the introduction. Everyone agreed. Jack Valenti gave Eric a look, and the two walked all the way into the mansion. They passed through the crowd of guests and came to a suite under the guidance of a waiter. "You must be very confused now, right?" Jack Valenti asked Eric to sit down on the sofa and asked with a smile. The gray-haired old man with sharp eyes in front of him was the most reliable spokesperson for Hollywood. Eric nodded without hiding anything. Although he had realized something, Eric was not worried that the other party would do something bad to Firefly Pictures. Otherwise, Jack Valenti would not have been able to hold the position of president of the Motion Picture Association of America for decades. Chapter 543. Jack Valenti's smile didn't fade as he said to Eric, "Little guy, Jurassic Park has brought me a lot of trouble during this period of time." Eric had already guessed it, so he asked, "It's about the GAT?" "Yeah," Jack Valenti nodded and said, "You should know that I've been working hard on the terms of the GAT for the past few years. Originally, many things were almost done, but since Jurassic Park was released in early June, there was a strong backlash from the European countries." Jack Valenti looked up at Eric and continued with a smile, "I've wanted to talk to you about this since last month, but you've been very elusive, and I've been very busy with my personal affairs, so I couldn't find the right time. This time, I finally got the chance." Eric was very clear about the final negotiation result of the GATT, so he was not too worried. He said, "Mr. Valenti, then this time—" Jack Valenti waved his hand and said, "Let me finish first. Regarding the negotiation of the GATT, we, Hollywood, will not intervene in other aspects. But regarding the negotiation of movies, in addition to the normal process, because of Hollywood's absolute advantage, we also need to rope in these European film forces to speak for us. This way, we can force the European governments to agree to include movies in the final agreement of the GATT. In order to accurately find the breakthrough point, Washington even used the power of the CIB. Everyone is sparing no effort in this matter." Eric understood very well. If he was not the owner of Firefly Pictures, Jack Valenti would definitely not be so straightforward. Roping in the European film forces was ultimately about the word profit. In the face of some efforts by the European government officials, the Big Seven naturally did not have to worry about it. Hollywood was related to millions of jobs in the United States and billions of dollars of trade surplus every year, so the Washington authorities had to do their best. However, in terms of movies, the Big Seven still had to do their own efforts. The ones who had the most intense conflict with Hollywood were, of course, the local film forces of the European countries. If these people could not be appeased, then under the strong interference of such forces, even if the European governments were willing to compromise, the relevant agreements would be difficult to sign. At this time, Eric had basically guessed the reason why Jack Valenti contacted him. "Mr. Valenti, are you talking about those people outside?" Eric pointed in the direction of the hall outside the door. Jack Valenti nodded and said, "So, kid, this time, you have to be generous. Give these greedy guys some benefits, then they won't come out and cause trouble. Instead, they'll speak for Hollywood." Although Eric respected this old man who worked hard for Hollywood's interests, he could not be the child of wealth for no reason. "Mr. Valenti, this should be done together with Hollywood, right?" "Of course, everyone should do it together. I've already talked to Warner Brothers, Universal, and Paramount. However, you should have heard the saying, the greater the power, the greater the responsibility. Firefly's performance in the past few years has been so dazzling, it's only right for them to contribute more." Eric realized that he could not escape this time. Although this matter was not forced, if the other film companies did what they should do and Firefly refused to cooperate, they might be marked in a small notebook. Although Jack Valenti just mentioned that Jurassic Park brought trouble to his work and did not complain too much. Eric could also see the huge resistance that Jurassic Park brought to the GATT negotiations from the recent European media. He smiled helplessly and said, "Mr. Valenti, I can only say that I'll do my best. I'm not a superhero. If they ask for too much, I think it's better to let them go to the captain of the US team." Jack Valenti laughed and said, "That's all I need to hear." Eric asked again, "Mr. Valenti, can I know what the conditions are from Warner Brothers?" Jack Valenti nodded and said, "Of course, the main promises include the priority of licensing the distribution rights of Hollywood movies, and receiving a certain amount of European capital to invest in movies every year." Investment in the production and distribution of Hollywood movies could be said to be the two main ways for overseas capital to enter Hollywood. The current promises were nothing more than priority and no difference. There were good and bad Hollywood movies. Movies that sold well at the box office would definitely attract more competitors in the process of overseas distribution. At this time, if they had priority, it would be easier to get the distribution contract. Indiscriminate investment was equivalent to investing a certain amount of funds into most of the movies of a film company. It was not like in the past, where the funds could only be invested in projects that the film company was not optimistic about, or invested in projects of independent production companies. This model was equivalent to sharing profits and losses with the film company. If the film company made money, the investors would definitely make money. If the film company lost money, the investors would also lose money. In recent years, there were not many film companies that lost money in the 7 major Hollywood studios. Eric thought for a moment and said, "Mr. Valenti, the distribution rights can be discussed, but the indiscriminate investment is more difficult for Firefly to accept." "These are all things that can be discussed." Jack Valenti's smile did not change. "Of course, I know about Firefly's situation. Firefly's profits last year were envied by many. However, I just want you to know, Eric." Jack Valenti changed his expression and even changed to a more formal form of address. "This negotiation is related to the interests of the entire Hollywood, so it is definitely not the time to be stingy. If this negotiation fails, who knows when the next negotiation will reach this level of progress. The GATT has been wrangling since 1947 and has been entangled for more than 40 years. There have been many breakdowns during this period, and this is the most completed one." Eric nodded solemnly after listening. Although the 1993 GATT was successfully signed, Eric was not sure if he, the butterfly, would mess up something that should have happened. Jack Valenti noticed Eric's expression and smiled with relief. He reached out and patted Eric's knee and said, "Eric, you know, I can't force you to agree to any conditions. You're doing all this for yourselves. An old man like me won't get any benefits. Although you're very young, since you've achieved so much at such a young age, I think you must understand the pros and cons. Although the 7 major Hollywood studios have always been competitors in China, in the face of external forces, their interests are always the same. Everyone should do their best for the major events that affect the future of Hollywood." Eric could sense that Jack Valenti was being so earnest because he still felt that he was too young. He could only nod solemnly again. "Mr. Valenti, I'll do my best." "Then I'm relieved." Jack Valenti stood up and said, "I don't know their specific requirements. You'll have to communicate with them personally. Let's go, these greedy guys must be waiting anxiously." Returning to the hall outside, the banquet had already begun. Under the bright and splendid lights, the hall was crowded with people, gathered in 2s and 3s, either raising their glasses or whispering. On the dance floor, there were also pairs of men and women dancing slowly to the gentle music. However, the moment the door of a room on the west side of the hall opened, the entire hall seemed to be quiet for a second. Then, the atmosphere returned to normal. The group of people who had personally welcomed Eric at the beginning also came over again. Eric's smile remained unchanged as he chatted with these people. The group of people unknowingly came to a relatively quiet corner where a sofa was placed. The waiter served champagne to everyone one by one. As the host, Nicholas Seydoux, asked, "Eric, you don't seem to have brought a date?" Because Claudia had several movie contracts with her, after signing her endorsement contract, she hurried back to Los Angeles. Even the follow-up commercials had to be shot in the studio in Los Angeles. Of course, she could not stay in Europe to accompany Eric. Well, I don't have a girlfriend. Eric shrugged. Everyone chuckled. Nicolas Seydoux continued, French girls are very passionate and romantic. You can talk to them more later. Eric looked at the men and women shuttling back and forth in the hall and smiled. I want to talk to them more now. There was another burst of laughter in the corner. The group of people said a few irrelevant words. At this time, different forces were basically gathered together, and some even belonged to different countries. And in this kind of occasion, of course, it was impossible to talk about specific matters. Eric only revealed in the chat that he would continue to stay in Paris for about a week, and hinted that Firefly would cooperate with them to a certain extent. Everyone quickly dispersed in satisfaction. Jack Valenti did not stay at the party for long. In less than half an hour, the old man received a phone call and had to leave in a hurry. Eric shuttled back and forth in the party hall, taking business cards from the people he had just met. He also made some preliminary appointments. Although the conversation did not involve any substantive issues, more than an hour still quietly passed by after these things were done. Eric was just about to rest for a while when he happened to see a black-haired girl in a black backless evening gown in the crowd. Only then did he remember the theme of tonight's party, the celebration party for Fragrant. Although Fragrant was like many French movies, the plot was a little messy as usual, but the details were exquisite everywhere. The first meeting on the rainy night, the dinner in the unfamiliar mansion, waking up on the beach, staring into the mirror, and so on, all left a deep impression on the audience. And Eric's favorite was undoubtedly the scene where Sophie danced in front of the mirror to brisk jazz music. Hello, Miss Marceau. Eric exchanged a glass of red wine from the waiter and walked over without hesitation. When the young man who was chatting with Sophie Marceau saw Eric, he consciously raised his glass and walked away. Sophie Marceau seemed to be relieved. When she faced Eric, the irritation between her eyebrows was still clear. As the woman who attracted the most attention at the party, there were definitely many people who came over to hit on her. Although Sophie Marceau knew Eric's identity, her tone did not seem very friendly. She said lightly, "Hello, Mr. Williams. It's nice to meet you." Eric did not mind the girl's cold tone. When he looked at this French rose up close, she seemed even more pure and charming. Sophie Marceau gave Eric the feeling that she was an exquisite work of art, even in her movies. This woman was so beautiful that Eric often felt that such a stunner should not even appear in those rough art movies with blurry graphics. Noticing the expression between the girl's eyebrows, Eric asked, "Is there something bothering you, Miss Marceau?" "No, Mr. Williams." Sophie Marceau shook her head and said lightly. She even raised her glass to Eric. Eric took a sip of red wine and said, "Then, let me guess. You don't like this party, do you?" "So what?" Sophie Marceau raised her eyebrows slightly and said. Eric smiled and said, "If that's the case, maybe I can help you solve this problem?" "How?" Eric said, "How about I take you away?" "That's too rude." Sophie Marceau shook her head. Eric smiled and did not answer immediately. He gestured to Sophie Marceau and walked out of the crowd. Sophie Marceau hesitated for a moment and followed. Eric brought Sophie Marceau to avoid the crowd and came to the villa's balcony. A man and woman who were chatting on the balcony noticed them coming over. The girl was about to say something when the middle-aged man patted the girl's back and greeted Eric with a smile before leaving with his female companion. The style of the terrace was the same as the villa. Outside the finely carved stone railings was a small garden. Under the bright street lights of the manor, it looked lush and verdant. At this time, there were also figures of 2s and 3s in the garden. Eric leaned against the stone railings comfortably and looked at the girl who could not help but take a deep breath. He said, "Do you feel much more relaxed?" "You don't like parties either?" Sophie Marceau asked in return. A party is supposed to bring joy to people. No matter how bad it is, it should be able to let people relax after a whole day of work. If the whole party is filled with people who are trying to get close to you with various motives, I don't think anyone will be able to get the joy they deserve from such a party. Sophie Marceau imitated Eric and leaned against the railings. She held the glass of red wine that was almost empty in her hand. Her expression suddenly revealed a hint of a young girl's slyness. "Then what's your motive for getting close to me?" "I think I should know you from my previous life, so I came up to say hello," Eric said, honestly. Sophie Marceau was stunned for a moment before she suddenly laughed. She was a 27-year-old woman, but her face still had some baby fat. Her smile was natural and pure. The girl raised her glass and clinked it with Eric's. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Williams. This is the most interesting pickup line I've ever heard." Eric took a sip of red wine and said, "Then what do you think my success rate is?" Sophie Marceau tilted her head and said with a smile, "From the current situation, 0. You have to know that girls hate men who use flowery words the most." Eric sighed with regret. "Looks like I have to work harder." Sophie Marceau said, "I think if you change your target, your success rate might instantly be full." Eric nodded pretentiously and looked in the direction of the hall, as if he was choosing something. Then, very coincidentally, a small figure wearing a princess dress ran towards the two of them as she stepped on the floor. It was a 7 or 8-year-old girl. She was small and had a fair and tender baby face. "Eric, you're Eric, right? The director of the dinosaur movie?" The girl was not interested in Sophie Marceau at all. She pounced in front of Eric, raised her small face, and asked in French without any fear of strangers. Eric did not know much French. He only knew some very simple daily communication terms. In his current situation, he did not have much time to specifically learn French. In the entire party, most of the people who spoke to him would take the initiative to speak in English. If not for the girl's pronunciation of Eric being exceptionally clear, Eric would not even know what the girl was saying. Helpless, Eric could only look at Sophie Marceau for help. "Sorry, Sophie, I don't know much French. Can you help me translate?" "Of course." Sophie nodded and said, "The little guy is asking you if you're the director of the dinosaur movie." When the girl saw that Eric ignored her and started chatting with Sophie, she immediately pouted unhappily and mumbled a few more sentences in French. This time, Eric could not understand her at all. Sophie smiled and continued to translate. She said, "You're really rude. You're actually treating a little lady with such an unfocused attitude." Eric looked at Sophie innocently. "Then how should I answer her?" Sophie smiled, pointed at Eric, and said a few sentences in French to the girl. Seeing the little guy say a few more sentences, Sophie smiled with interest and said to Eric, "She said she forgave you. She also said you're really stupid." She could speak very fluently when she was 2.5 years old. "You're already in your 20s, but you still haven't learned it." Chapter 544. Eric didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard Sophie's translation. Children's logic was always unreasonable. The little girl in the princess dress in front of him was obviously a French-centric like many proud French people. She naturally felt that others should learn French instead of adapting to others. Although France and Britain were separated by the sea, the French's English level was at the bottom of the entire Europe. This could be seen from the unanimous backlash from French employees and tourists when Disneyland in Paris used English as a working language. Sophie thought the little girl was very interesting. She bowed slightly and said something to the little girl. But perhaps it was the natural rejection of beautiful women. The little girl was not interested in Sophie at all. Instead, she gently rolled her eyes at her. Eric saw Sophie's slightly embarrassed expression, but he didn't ask about the content of the conversation. Instead, he said to the little girl, "Little girl, I still don't know your name." Although she had just used her taunting skill on Sophie, the little girl didn't treat her as an outsider at all. When she heard Eric speak, she looked at Sophie again. Sophie had no choice but to translate. She said her name is Leah. Eric was about to praise the little girl's name out of habit, but he quickly reacted. This was the Sido family's mansion. A little girl who could freely walk around this kind of party without an adult following her was basically the child of the owner. So, the little girl's name was on the tip of his tongue. Leah Sido. Eric carefully looked at the little girl's appearance. There were indeed some traces of her in his memory. In the original space-time, several major Hollywood film companies were tilting more and more resources into big-budget movies, which caused Hollywood to leave fewer and fewer opportunities for newcomers. Therefore, the second generation of Hollywood was more obviously exposed to the public. For various reasons, the film companies were also very willing to give opportunities to the second generation with a certain level of popularity. Hollywood men usually had a very long shelf life, so it was destined that this batch of successful second generation were mostly women. Leah Seydoux was one of them. In the original space-time, the little girl in front of him not only frequently appeared in the movies of legendary Hollywood directors such as Woody Allen, Quentin Tarantino, and Ridley Scott, but also got important roles in various commercial blockbusters such as Mission Impossible 4, 007, Ghost Rider, and so on. Such resources were enough to make ordinary actresses with both good looks and acting skills in Hollywood go crazy with jealousy. Leah Seydoux, who was still a little girl of 7 or 8 years old, noticed that Eric's mind had wandered off again. A look of dissatisfaction appeared on her face again. After mumbling some French words, she turned around and ran toward the hall without looking back. Sophie gloated as she translated. She said, "You're really rude, and she's decided not to watch your movies anymore." Eric stared at the little girl's back and laughed. "Did I lose a fan?" "That seems to be the case," Sophie chuckled. The sudden appearance of the little girl made the unfamiliarity between Eric and Sophie dissipate a lot. As a time traveler, Eric not only had most of Sophie Marceau's movies stored in his memory, but he also knew much more about Sophie than the girl herself thought. Therefore, Eric could easily grasp the topic that Sophie was interested in. Under Eric's subtle attacks, the French Rose showed an expression of having found a confidant in her in less than an hour. "Eric, you're so right. I also think that marriage is just a kind of restraint. Of course, people who love each other have to be together, but if they don't love each other anymore, there's no need to continue to be entangled. It will only make both parties feel pain, so I never plan to get married." Sophie drank a few more glasses of red wine while chatting. At this time, the girl already looked slightly tipsy. When she said these words, her brows were slightly furrowed, as if she was thinking of something troubling her. Many things were easier said than done. How could it be so easy to say that you don't want to be entangled? A waiter dragging a tray passed by. When Eric saw that Sophie was about to take red wine from the waiter again, he reached out his hand to stop her and motioned for the waiter to leave. "I don't think you should drink any more," Eric softly advised. Sophie frowned slightly, but quickly showed a beautiful smile. "Hey, Eric, don't you want me to get drunk?" "Of course, I've even thought about your program, after you get drunk." Eric lazily leaned on the railing again. "So, I'm just provoking your reverse psychology now to make you drink more." Sophie stared at Eric in disbelief, then laughed as if there was no one around, attracting the attention of many people in the hall. Fortunately, the girl did not completely lose her mind. After laughing a few times, she quickly restrained her expression. "Eric, you're a very interesting person. You have to know that arousing a woman's curiosity is often the first step for a man to seduce a woman." Sophie's clear eyes widened a little. She moved closer to Eric and asked like a naive little girl, "What's the second step?" "The second step." Eric leaned forward slightly, reached out, and easily grabbed the girl's delicate chin. In the other party's eyes, which were mixed with panic and eagerness, he kissed her without hesitation. Waking up in the slight coolness of the morning in Paris, Eric felt a warm body carefully trying to escape from his embrace. His arm habitually grabbed the woman back, and he opened his eyes when the woman exclaimed in surprise. Sophie's body stiffened for a moment, and there was a slight tremble in her voice. "Eric, you're awake?" "Yeah, good morning, Sophie." Eric leaned over and kissed the woman gently on the face. Sophie felt that Eric had changed into a comfortable position with his arms around her. It seemed that he wanted to continue sleeping. She leaned against the man's warm embrace reluctantly. After a few more minutes, Sophie resolutely removed Eric's hand from her waist, sat up, and began to put on her clothes. Seeing Eric leaning against the bed and watching her movements, Sophie felt shy, which she rarely felt when shooting certain scenes in the past. After putting on her clothes and tying her messy hair into a simple ponytail, the girl looked more natural. She looked around the spacious bedroom, looking for her handbag. "You should have left it in the living room," Eric suddenly said in a gentle tone. "Thank you, Eric." Sophie paused and said, "I was very happy last night, but now I think I have to go." Eric showed a sad expression. "Seeing that I was played by you all night, don't you want to leave a kiss?" Sophie's face was slightly red, and she chuckled. She leaned over the bed and quickly kissed Eric on the lips. She quickly ran away and slipped all the way to the bedroom door before saying goodbye to Eric. A moment later, the sound of the door closing came from the living room, and the suite was quiet again. Eric smiled for a moment, then began to get dressed and got up. He could understand Sophie's struggle just now, so he didn't force her to stay. This was a woman who was extremely unrestrained. Forcing too much would only make her run further and further away. It was better to let nature take its course. Anyway, there was still a long way to go. After getting closer, Eric found that Chris's entourage was behind him, and the one walking beside him was a middle-aged man who had nothing to do with Firefly's investment. The middle-aged man was about 40 years old and wore a pair of rimless glasses. At first glance, his mediocre appearance gave people a clumsy feeling. However, Eric did not despise this middle-aged man at all because he had seen his photo more than once in relevant information. This person was Yoma Alala, the current CEO of Nokia. Although his appearance was ordinary, Yoma Alala's resume was not mediocre at all. Not only did this person have a double master's degree in economics, but he also served as an executive of Citibank in his early 30s. In the original space-time, it was under his leadership that Nokia went from a company on the verge of bankruptcy to the position of global communications equipment overlord. "Eric, long time no see." Chris hugged Eric and quickly took the initiative to introduce him. "I think you must know him, Mr. Yoma Alala." Yoma Alala took the initiative to step forward and shook hands with Eric. "Mr. Williams, I'm Yoma Alala. It's nice to meet you. I like your movies very much." "Thank you, just call me Eric." Eric let go of Yoma Alala's hand and did not care about the other party's slightly scrutinizing smile. He turned and greeted the Firefly investment team members brought by Chris. Everyone left the airport, and Eric got into his car with Chris. As soon as the car started, Chris could not wait to open the suitcase he carried with him. "Eric, according to the information you sent back to New York, I once again asked people to evaluate Nokia." Eric interrupted Chris and smiled as he pointed to the car behind him. "You haven't told me what happened to Yoma Alala. Why did he come to Paris with you?" Chris smiled and temporarily closed the suitcase. He said, "I practically picked him up from New York. I know Yoma Alala went to Wall Street to invest in Nokia, but the situation shouldn't be as bad as you said, right? As far as I know, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and other major investment banks are not very interested in investing in Nokia because Boston Consulting Group published a report more than a year ago, claiming that Nokia's mobile phone business is completely unable to compete with Motorola and Japanese mobile phone manufacturers. In the end, Lehman Brothers, which had just gotten rid of the control of American Express, was interested in investing. However, Lehman Brothers is now very short of funds, and the conditions they offered were relatively harsh. When I contacted Yoma Alala, he had already negotiated with the manager of Lehman Brothers' investment department for a month, and the negotiations had not broken down. From this point of view, this person is indeed very capable, but at the same time, he has become a hindrance to our acquisition of Nokia. Since he won't easily compromise with a giant like Lehman Brothers, that means he won't easily compromise with us either. Eric asked, "Then did you get the details of the negotiations between him and Lehman Brothers?" Chris nodded slyly. "Of course," Chris said as he opened the suitcase, took out a few documents, and handed them to Eric. The dispute between Yoma Alala and Lehman Brothers is mainly focused on the size of the capital injection and the timing of the listing. Lehman Brothers initially only agreed to invest $50 million, but they wanted to take 10% of Nokia's shares. In addition, Lehman Brothers conditions were to help Nokia get listed in 3 years, but Yoma Alala hoped that Lehman Brothers could directly get Nokia listed in order to extract development funds from the stock market. Eric read the documents in front of him and wondered, why is he in a hurry to get listed? If Nokia's development prospects are good, wouldn't he be able to get more benefits by getting listed later? I also asked someone to analyze this, Chris explained. Most of Nokia's shares are currently concentrated in the hands of a few banks in Finland. This means that any major business adjustment by Nokia requires the approval of the shareholders of the banks. This situation also causes Nokia's management to have limited room to act independently. But if Nokia can be listed in North America, Nokia will become a company with public shares. This way, the management will have more room to act. They only need to be responsible to the shareholders, and they won't have to listen to the orders of the shareholders of the banks. In the end, he still wants more power, right? Chris nodded. Yes, so when I first contacted Yoma Alala, he wasn't too enthusiastic about Firefly's investment. I was worried that if he continued to talk with Lehman Brothers, they would suddenly reach a cooperation agreement, so I revealed some information about Cisco to him. Only then did he agree to go back to Europe with me. Although Firefly Investment hid Cisco's shares among several investment funds, it was still the largest shareholder of Cisco. However, other than the necessary personnel and financial supervision of Cisco, Firefly Investment did not intervene much in the company's operations. Eric knew that Yoma Alala probably saw this. Speaking of which, last week, Cisco completed the merger of COC Communications and expanded Cisco's business into the Catalyst 5000 switch field. After this merger, our shares have slipped to 31%. However, according to the stock price before the close last Friday, Cisco's current market value has reached $5.3 billion. The detailed information is still being sorted out by the headquarters. Once it's done, it will be sent to your email. I'm just giving you a brief summary. Eric nodded to show that he understood. Ever since President Clinton came to power and announced the Information Superhighway Plan, the stock prices of computer-related companies had skyrocketed in the past 6 months. Cisco's stock price had more than doubled since the beginning of the year. Although the craziest time for internet technology stocks had yet to arrive, this trend had already attracted the attention of a large number of Wall Street investors. After Chris finished speaking, he quickly took out a delicately wrapped gift box from his suitcase. Here, the second thing, someone asked me to bring you a gift. Eric did not notice the smirk on Chris's face. He opened the wrapping paper with some confusion and found a 32 by 32 photo frame inside. In the photo, 2 chubby little guys were sitting on the sofa. The little boy was staring at the camera with his eyes wide open. The little girl, who looked very much like Joanna, was restlessly reaching out her little hand as if she wanted to grab something. When Eric saw the photo, he remembered that the 2 little guys were born on April 10th. A few days ago, it was the 3-month anniversary of the 2 little guys' birth. He had forgotten about this matter and had not called back in the past few days. It seemed that Virginia must be very angry, so she asked Chris to bring him a gift. Chris said, on the day of Kevin's baptism, Emily and I were also there. I am now the little guy's godfather. I thought you would definitely know, so I didn't inform you. The day before yesterday, Emily went to visit the 2 little guys and brought back this thing. She asked me to give it to you. Only then did I know that you haven't called back in the past few days. Western children would generally be baptized a few months after birth. Eric did not expect Virginia to do it directly without discussing it with him. He smiled awkwardly. Then, he realized something and asked, Kevin's baptism? What about Shashya? Chris spread out his hands and said, this should be something you and Joanna should discuss. Noticing Eric's puzzled expression, Chris said, Joanna is a Jew. Jews follow their mother. Traditionally, Shashya should also be considered a Jew. In terms of bloodline, she can also be considered as an Englishwoman. Most Englishmen believe in Christianity, so you and Joanna should discuss which religion to let the little guy follow. Eric felt a little strange and murmured, my daughter is actually a Jew. After knowing Eric for so long, Chris also realized that Eric was a person who was very insensitive to race. Therefore, he He also knew that Eric's words just now did not mean any discrimination. He smiled and said, "Yes, if you let Xia take over your job in the future, she will definitely be very popular in Hollywood." "I just feel a little strange." Eric also smiled and said, "What about you, Chris? Which ethnic group is your family?" Chris said, "My family is Norwegian immigrants who migrated from the era of the Great Voyage." "Now, we should be considered an American." "Norway, I thought Hansen was also a British surname," Eric said with a smile. "The arrogance in the bones of the British," Chris joked and then explained. "The surname Hansen means son of Hans. If you read fairy tales, you will find that the name Hans often appears in Nordic fairy tales. Norway is one of the 5 Nordic countries." Eric put away the photos of the 2 little guys and said, "Well, let's not talk about this for the time being. Let's go back to Nokia." Chris nodded and took out a few documents from the suitcase. "These are some comparative tests I commissioned Cisco's technical department to do. The communication method used by Nokia completely suppresses most mobile communication devices at this stage. Now, the mainstream mobile phone uses analog signals because it uses pulse signals. It is very easy to interfere with the transmission process and cause distortion in the call quality. In fact, many mobile communication equipment companies are researching new communication systems. From the test results given by Cisco's technical department, the digital signal used by Nokia's 1011 mobile phone is very stable. This signal uses the same binary principle as a computer. There is no distortion in the transmission process at all. So, I think that if the GSM network used by Nokia can be promoted, it will cause a huge change in mobile communication equipment. Nokia, who is the first to introduce the GSM system, will also gain a great advantage. If we don't want our investment to go down the drain, the first thing we have to do after the acquisition is to lobby European countries to fully adopt the GSM system." Eric said, "This seems to be something to do after the acquisition, right?" Chapter 546. Since you have made up your mind, of course, I have to consider the long term. Chris smiled and said, "As for the acquisition, the information you have collected is very comprehensive. Although Nokia's 1011 mobile phone has been selling well recently, Nokia's own difficulties have not been solved. Plus, we have the advantage of capital, so acquiring Nokia is not a big problem. What we need to discuss is the acquisition method. Eric, if you fully acquire it, the premium will be very high, and your original plan to acquire the TV network will be hindered. Now, among the 4 major TV networks in North America, Fox is developing the fastest, so it will definitely not be sold. The market value of the other 3 TV networks is more than $10 billion. If you use the stock exchange method, you will even lose the absolute control of Firefly." In fact, Eric had been thinking about these issues. A windfall like the Gulf War would definitely not happen a second time. When the IT stock boom, it would take a few more years to make money, but the acquisition of the TV network should be done as soon as possible. Eric vaguely remembered some data. In the original spacetime, the order of the merger of the 3 major TV networks in North America was ABC, CBS, and NBC. In 1996, Disney completed the acquisition of ABC for about $19 billion, but only 3 years later, in 1999, Viacom spent $37 billion to acquire CBS. The scale of the 2 TV networks was not too different. The reason for this situation was mainly because of the rapid economic growth in the United States in the 1990s, which caused the stock price to rise. Chris, with the current performance of Firefly, do you think it is feasible to use the method of issuing corporate bonds to acquire the TV network? Chris thought for a moment. Eric did not hide many of his plans. If they followed the plan completely according to Eric's communication with him, Firefly could raise about $5 billion in cash during the negotiation process of acquiring the TV network. However, if they wanted to acquire any of the 3 major TV networks, to be safe, the capital scale was about $15 billion. $15 billion minus $5 billion. Thinking of this, Chris suddenly opened his eyes wide and looked at Eric in disbelief. Issuing $10 billion of corporate bonds, Eric, you are really crazy. Not to mention $10 billion of debt financing. Even in the world until 1993, there were very few mergers and acquisitions that involved more than $10 billion of funds, not to mention issuing $10 billion of corporate debt to acquire a company. This could only be described as crazy. Eric did not mind Chris's shocked expression. He said, "Chris, think about it from another angle. We all know about MGM's current situation. MGM's current assets are around $1 billion to $5 billion, but the company's debt is as high as $7 billion. The debt ratio is more than 100%. But if Firefly completes the acquisition of the television network, it will have no problem reaching $30 billion. Then, with the current debt, it will only be less than 40%. But Eric, a debt of $1 billion and a debt of $10 billion is no longer a simple matter of numbers." Of course, Eric knew this. Investors usually bought corporate bonds because the risk of bonds was relatively low. They didn't have to bear the risk brought about by the ups and downs of corporate performance like stocks. Therefore, the larger the amount involved, the more cautious the investors would be. Even a giant like General Motors Group had not discovered $10 billion of corporate debt at once. However, Eric was full of confidence. In his memory, when Disney acquired ABC TV in the original spacetime, they successfully completed $10 billion of debt financing. Moreover, Firefly Pictures' current operating situation was much better than Disney's in the parallel spacetime. Chris, perhaps for other companies, issuing $10 billion of corporate debt at once is indeed a large amount of money to make Wall Street investors flinch. But Firefly Pictures is different. Last year, Firefly Pictures' net profit was close to $1 billion. And this year, Jurassic Park, The Bug Crisis, and Clash of the Worlds, the net profit from the box office of the three movies will reach $500 million. And this is only a part of the movie's overall operation. This kind of profitability is enough to dispel the concerns of most investors. Chris was about to speak when the car suddenly stopped. Eric looked out of the window and found that the car had stopped in the hotel's underground parking lot. Chris put the documents back into the suitcase and said, "Eric, I will pay attention to this matter. When I return to New York, I will find time to do a feasibility assessment. Yoma Alala may return to Finland in the afternoon, so we only have one lunchtime with him. Let's focus on Nokia first." Eric nodded and got out of the car. It was almost noon when Chris and the others were settled. Eric and Chris hosted a banquet for Yoma Alala in a nearby restaurant on behalf of Firefly. According to the discussion between Eric and Chris, Firefly Investment would issue an acquisition offer to Nokia within 3 days. Before the acquisition was completed, they and Yoma Alala would be on opposite sides for the time being. Therefore, the conversation between the two sides at this luncheon did not involve too many substantive issues. Eric just talked to Yoma Alala about why he was interested in Nokia, and Yoma Alala talked about the prospects of digital mobile phones and the Global Mobile Communication Network, GSM. In the end, both the guests and the host enjoyed themselves. Yoma Alala returned to Finland in the afternoon and had a preliminary communication with the current shareholders of Nokia Group's major banks. Eric and Chris rented the hotel's conference room and began to discuss the specific acquisition plan. Although Nokia Group had divested or sold the loss-making paper, rubber, and television businesses in recent years, as a once diversified Finnish giant, in addition to the mobile communication equipment department, Nokia Group also owned other businesses such as energy, pharmaceuticals, and cables. This part of the assets had been in a profitable state and had not been divested or sold. It accounted for about 1/3 of the group's total assets. Although mobile communication companies in some European countries had begun to operate the GSM network and thus increased the sales of Nokia's first GSM mobile phone, 1011, the GSM network had not been fully popularized. In addition to the huge investment in research and development in the early stages, although the GSM mobile phone had a bright future, Nokia's mobile phone department was still in a state of loss. The funds had been fed back by other profitable departments. Except for Eric, who was a traveler, no one could predict the explosive growth potential of GSM mobile phones in the next few years. Without seeing actual profits, the shareholders of Nokia Group would not tolerate this situation to continue. This was also the reason why Yoma Alala urgently needed external investment. Everyone knew that energy and pharmaceuticals were industries full of huge profits, but Eric was not interested at all. After all, in terms of scale, Nokia's businesses were nothing in front of those giants. After a detailed discussion, Eric finally decided that the most important plan was to acquire Nokia's mobile communication department. This department not only included the mobile phone business but also the communication equipment business. It mainly produced base station equipment for the GSM network. As the first country to use the GSM network, Nokia's technology in this area was much more advanced than other communication equipment manufacturers. The next afternoon, Eric and Chris walked out of the conference room together. Chris still had a stack of documents in his hand and said, "In order to develop GSM mobile phones, Nokia Group has been losing money for the past 2 years. That is to say, Nokia invested all the profits generated by those profitable departments into the development of GSM mobile phones. Now that the results are out, I think that as long as Nokia shareholders have a little foresight, they will not sell the mobile communication department to us. Who knows? Maybe Nokia shareholders are in a hurry to cash out," Eric said. "But no matter what, we have to at least get absolute control of Nokia." This was the bottom line of the acquisition that the team had discussed over the past 2 days. Chris also nodded in agreement and said, "Then, I will send a formal acquisition offer to Nokia tomorrow morning." Also, regarding the name of the offshore investment fund that we just discussed, you can name it. Because the tax rates in each country were different, in the process of cross-border acquisition, the circulation of large sums of money would always involve tax issues. The usual solution was to inject the funds into an offshore company, and then invest through the offshore company. At the same time, this kind of offshore investment could also play the role of hiding assets. Although it was only 1993, because of the various conveniences of offshore investment, the scale of funds in various offshore capital centers around the world had exceeded $1 trillion. Eric remembered the 2 little guys' voices when he was on the phone in New York yesterday. He quickly said, "Let's call it the Hawaii Fund." Chris nodded and smiled. "Do you prefer daughters?" "Yeah. Haven't you heard of that saying? The son is the father's enemy in the previous life, and the daughter is the father's lover in the previous life. There seems to be such a saying, and I think it's quite scientific. For a long time, my relationship with my father wasn't very good, but Emily and her father have always been very harmonious. Perhaps you don't know, but I've had a few arguments with Emily's father, and she's always stood on her father's side." Chris said with a smile, then said, "Then I'll have someone register this name." Eric nodded. The meeting room was at the bottom floor of the hotel. The 2 of them came to the end of the corridor. The rest of the team went directly to the restaurant for dinner, but Eric had to go upstairs to change his clothes. Chris also had something to do in his room. While waiting for the elevator, Chris asked curiously, "Which company is the appointment tonight?" In addition to Nokia, in order to cooperate with the negotiations of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Eric also had to discuss cooperation with the European film industry. The biggest shareholder of MGM is Credit Lyonnais. The 2 movies released by MGM during the summer season have suffered huge losses. Credit Lyonnais failed to auction MGM last year, and now they want to get rid of MGM even more. But before they get rid of MGM, they hope that MGM's performance will recover, so that it will be easier for them to find another company. When the elevator door opened, Chris and Eric moved aside to let the guests in the elevator leave. Chris pressed the button and asked, "Have you never thought of buying MGM?" "Of course I want to. I am very jealous of MGM's huge film library. If I can get MGM's film library, not only will I be able to fully utilize Firefly's current operating resources, but it will also be greatly beneficial for the future development of the television network. After all, the television network still needs a lot of high-quality content. But other than the film library, there is nothing in MGM that can tempt me." In the change of hands in 1986, Ted Turner only kept MGM's film library before 1948. This was also the reason why Time Warner's Turner Broadcasting started to broadcast MGM's old movies in recent years. However, MGM still owned the rights to more than 4,000 movies and even more TV series. The film library was second only to Time Warner. But because of MGM's continuous losses for many years, this once glorious movie giant could not fully utilize its huge film library. It could only continue to struggle in the vicious cycle of borrowing and continuous losses. Chris said, "Isn't there still the rights to 007? With MGM's current debt scale, according to the annual interest rate of 5%, the annual debt interest payment is as high as 80 million yuan. On average, MGM releases a 007 movie every 2 years. The profit generated is not even enough to pay the interest of the company's debt. That's why MGM has been losing money these years, and the debt is increasing." Eric casually talked about MGM. Suddenly, he had an idea. He could not help but kick the elevator wall with the tip of his foot. He said excitedly, "I suddenly thought of a good idea." Chris looked at him in confusion. Compared to a giant like Credit Lyonnais, these European film companies are all small fish and shrimps. If Credit Lyonnais is the matchmaker, and MGM is the carrier, Firefly will be able to get out of this matter. There is no need to interrupt the established operating track. Chris already knew what Firefly had to do to cooperate with the GATT negotiations. After listening to Eric's words, he immediately understood what he meant. Originally, many of Firefly's production plans for next year and even the year after had been confirmed. In order to cooperate with the GATT negotiations, Firefly needed to share some of its resources with the European film forces. Then, Firefly's established development plan must be adjusted accordingly. But if Firefly indirectly cooperated with the European film companies through MGM, the headquarters would not need to make too many adjustments. However, Chris was not very optimistic about Eric's idea. "You just said that MGM's current annual profit may not even be enough to pay the interest of the company's debt. I think those European film companies will not be unaware of this. Do you think they will agree? Then invite all parties to sit down and negotiate. With MGM's current situation, I think as long as we can lead the company out of the predicament, those creditors will also agree to temporarily give up some interests. Otherwise, once the company goes bankrupt, MGM's assets will not even be enough to repay its current debts. The biggest problem for MGM now is that they do not have enough funds to start more film projects. The creditors have demands, the European film companies have funds, and Firefly can provide high-quality film projects. These conditions can almost revive this dead film company. Do you think they will be tempted?" Chris nodded, but said, "Didn't you just say that you are tempted by MGM's film library? If MGM really came back from the dead as you said, you'll have to pay a higher price to acquire this film company in the future." Chapter 547. Let's talk about the future in the future. Eric shook his head and smiled, but he wasn't too worried about this problem. The fundamental problem with MGM was still in its business philosophy. Until now, MGM still maintained the vertical business philosophy passed down from the era of big studios. But since the 1980s, several other major Hollywood film companies had begun to try to diversify their development. They worked hard to open up surrounding industrial chains related to movies, such as audio and video, books, records, toys, theme parks, and so on, maximizing the locomotive effect of the movie business. Through the development of profit channels, it increased the film company's ability to resist risks. But at the same time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer fell into the hands of the casino tycoon, Kirk Kerkorian, who preferred to play with capital operations. The casino tycoon was obviously more interested in transforming Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer into a hotel than making a movie. As a result, the veteran movie giant missed the best opportunity to transform. And now, the Hollywood film companies that had opened up the industrial chain began a new trend of integration with the media groups. Once this trend was completed, MGM would be completely left behind, and there would be no chance for it to catch up with the pace of its peers who were integrated with the media groups. In this case, Eric providing some high-quality film projects for MGM would only make the film company prosperous for a while. In the future, when everyone was busy dividing the profits, MGM would still be the declining MGM. After saying goodbye to Chris, Eric went back to his room to change his clothes. He then took a car to a restaurant in New York on the banks of the Seine. He was going to meet a vice president named Marcel Noir in the investment department of Credit Lyonnais Bank and the current president of MGM Pictures, John Kerry. In 1990, Kirk Corkerian sold MGM to an Italian investor, Giancarlo Parenti, for $1.3 billion. However, not long after, the U.S. Federal Securities and Exchange Commission discovered that there was a major problem with the transaction. The Italian investor, Giancarlo Parenti's company, was just an empty shell. The whole transaction process was completely a fraud to acquire MGM. Giancarlo Parenti was eventually jailed for this fraud, but Credit Lyonnais was the biggest victim, because Credit Lyonnais Bank was the financier of the transaction. At the end of last year, the fraud case was finally decided, and Giancarlo got the punishment he deserved. But the transaction was still declared valid. The 75% shares of MGM that Giancarlo Parenti got from Corkery were transferred to Credit Lyonnais Bank. In order to get rid of MGM, Credit Lyonnais Bank organized an auction, but no one dared to take over the mess. Credit Lyonnais Bank could only reorganize the management of MGM and poach Frank Marcheso and John Kerry to form a new management team, hoping to improve MGM's performance and find a successor smoothly. But now, the two new helmers got off to a bad start. The two movies, Bear Peak and Last Action Hero, released in the summer season with a lot of money, both ended in failure. Along the way, Eric was thinking about the plan to match the cooperation between the European Film Company and MGM. After the hotel car stopped, Eric saw two white men greeting him warmly as soon as he got out of the car. Eric recognized John Kerry, who was about 60 years old and had gray hair, at a glance. Eric had seen him at some events in Los Angeles before, but until the celebration party of Fragrant, the two had no interaction. John Kerry was originally a senior executive in the production department of Warner Pictures. He had been working in Warner Pictures since the end of the 60s, and was an old man from the era of Steve Ross. After Steve Ross's death, the two co-presidents of Warner Pictures gradually intensified their internal strife for the position of CEO. Coupled with the invitation from Credit Lyonnais Bank, John Kerry left his old employer, where he had worked for many years, to become the president of MGM Pictures. Eric blamed the unlucky CEO of Carlock Pictures for the hype of Bear Peak and Jurassic Park, so he didn't know that it was actually the two helmers of MGM who created this mess. However, even if he knew, Eric wouldn't care too much now. Anyway, the two movies from MGM had now ended in failure, and it didn't have any impact on Jurassic Park. Seeing John Kerry greeting him warmly with another Frenchman in his 40s or 50s with a big nose, Eric also walked up quickly with a smile. "Eric, I'm glad you could come tonight." John Kerry hugged Eric and then introduced, "This is Mr. Marcel Noir from Credit Lyonnais Bank." "Hello, Mr. Noir." Eric reached out to the other party. Marcel Noir and Eric chatted for a while before the three walked into the restaurant. The waiter led the three to a quiet corner. After ordering, Marcel Noir couldn't wait to get straight to the point. Although Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer ranked last among the 7 major Hollywood studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's scale could be said to be the largest in Europe. What surprised Eric but also felt reasonable was that Credit Lyonnais Bank actually hoped that Firefly could take over MGM. After Marcel Noir made this suggestion, he noticed Eric's slightly surprised look and continued, "Eric, as long as you agree to take over MGM, Credit Lyonnais is willing to give a very reasonable price. Moreover, we will also be responsible for lobbying the U.S. Federal Securities and Exchange Commission to pass this transaction request." Firefly Pictures had now reached a peak in Hollywood. If it continued to expand in the film business, it would definitely involve the issue of monopoly. It could be imagined that if Firefly Pictures merged with other major Hollywood studios again, it would definitely receive pressure from all sides. However, Eric was very clear that among the film companies other than Firefly Pictures, other goals were difficult to achieve at the moment. However, if he launched the acquisition of MGM, the resistance would be much less. There would even be people secretly facilitating this. The ruling of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission was also greatly influenced by capital forces. If Firefly acquired MGM at this time, it was equivalent to taking a big burden into their arms. This big burden would definitely drag down the pace of Firefly's expansion and affect the evaluation of Firefly Pictures by investment institutions. If it were other times, in the face of MGM's rich film library resources, Eric would not mind taking over MGM and slowly adjusting it. However, in the next few years, Firefly would not stop accelerating the pace of expansion. At this time, it was absolutely impossible to take over the mess of MGM. Since Marcel Noir was so direct, Eric did not beat around the bush. He bluntly refused, "Marcel, I'm really sorry. I can't agree to your request because I can't think of any reason to take over MGM now." Of course, Credit Lyonnais could not have guessed Eric's strong interest in MGM's film library. Therefore, Eric's reaction was not unexpected by Marcel Noir. He originally did not have much hope that Eric would agree to this matter. He proposed this proposal to Eric out of desperation. Credit Lyonnais was one of the 3 major banks in France. Not only did it operate traditional banking business, but it also involved investment banking and insurance. Because of the European economic recession caused by the turmoil in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, Credit Lyonnais fell into huge losses for several years in a row. The amount of losses this year was expected to be as high as 11 billion francs, equivalent to $2 billion US. The MGM that was affected by the fraud case accounted for a large part of the losses. Credit Lyonnais was now eager to cash out this hot potato. Because he did not have much hope in his heart, after hearing Eric's refusal, Marcel Noir did not continue to pester him. When the waiter in the restaurant served the dishes one after another, Marcel Noir gently winked at John Carey. John Carey nodded slightly, put down his knife and fork, and turned to Eric. "Eric, I don't know if you are interested in the 007 series?" Eric smiled slightly, thinking that it was indeed the case. However, speaking of which, MGM really did not have any bargaining chips to cooperate with him. The only thing Credit Lyonnais wanted to do now was to sell MGM. It did not want to invest in Firefly's film business like other European film companies. The 007 series was like a life-saving ginseng for MGM. Every time they were terminally ill, they would cut off a piece, and then they could live on for a few years. Before the 16th 007, whether it was during United Artists or MGM era, the production cycle of 007 was 2 years. The reason why this long-lasting series was suddenly stopped 4 years ago, in addition to MGM's continuous turmoil and copyright disputes, was mainly because the 16th 007, License to Kill, was too bad in box office and reputation. The budget of License to Kill was $32 million at that time, but it only earned more than $33 million at the box office in the United States. If it were not for the global recovery of the loss, Maid of Murder almost became the first loss-making sequel of the 007 series. For a classic legendary agent series, the loss of one investment was of course nothing, but MGM was more afraid that the reputation of the series would be completely destroyed. If the 17th or even the 18th movie still could not be recognized by the fans, then the series was likely to be completely stopped. Therefore, MGM hesitated for several years in the process of starting the production of the 17th 007 movie, and until now, there was no result. Speaking of the last License to Kill, although the reputation of this sequel is very bad, I think one of the settings is very interesting, Eric replied. He could not help but think of Kelly Lowe, who played Sam's deceased wife in Sleepless in Seattle. Kelly Lowe was the Bond girl in License to Kill. Eric and Kelly Lowe had a night of fun in Seattle, but the girl left after that night, and Eric never saw her again. When John Carrier heard Eric's words, he asked naturally, "What setting?" "The setting of 2 Bond girls." License to Kill is the only 007 movie where 2 Bond girls are jealous of Bond and even shed tears because of it. Unfortunately, the plot conceived by the screenwriter of the last movie was more focused on a revenge movie, but it lost the essence of a Bond movie, so it did not highlight the 2 Bond girls. Moreover, I also think that there is something wrong with the setting of 2 Bond girls. John Carrier hesitated, but still chose the first key point in Eric's words and asked, "Eric, what do you think is the essence of the 007 movie?" Eric smiled mischievously and said, "Of course it is to save the world." John Carrier and Marcel Noir, who was on the other side, were stunned for a moment before laughing along with Eric. But after laughing, John Carrier realized that although Eric's words were a little teasing, they hit the core of the 007 series, so he immediately asked, "What do you mean by the setting of two Bond girls?" Eric was also interested. He put down the cutlery and said, "In the traditional production idea, the Bond girls have always been Bond's assistant or lover. Even if there are two Bond girls in the 16th movie, it still can't escape this mindset. But why don't we do the opposite and set two Bond girls, one good and one evil? One is Bond's assistant, and the other is Bond's enemy." Just like Warner's two recent Batman movies, although Batman's actor, Michael Keaton, was quite popular, the villains in both the first and second movies attracted more attention from the audience. Needless to say, Jack Nicholson's Joker will definitely be a classic imitated by later generations, and Michelle Pfeiffer and Danny DeVito's Catwoman and Penguin also left a deep impression on the audience. This shows that after watching so many righteous protagonists in the movies, the audience is still very much looking forward to the villains with distinctive characters. This is a big breakthrough for the 007 series. When Marcel Noir heard Eric's words, he subconsciously felt that it made sense, but he didn't have a deep feeling about it. However, John Carrier, who had been in the production industry for more than 20 years, had a glint in his eyes. As a former executive of Warner Bros.' production department, John Carrier had also experienced the joy of the success of the first Batman series. But internally, Warner Bros. Only attributed the success of the Batman series to the popularity accumulated over decades of comic serialization. They didn't think too deeply about it. Eric's casual words at this time made John Carrier feel suddenly enlightened. Perhaps Warner Bros.' more than 50 million share for Jack Nicholson's Joker role was not too unjust. At the same time, John Carrier could not help admiring Eric's keen thinking and vision. It was not unreasonable for this young man to achieve such dazzling success at such a young age. Although John Carrier sighed in his heart, he did not forget to strike while the iron was hot. "Eric, since you have such an idea, why not just be the director of the 17th 007 movie? MGM will definitely give you a satisfactory offer." Eric picked up the red wine beside him and took a sip. However, he did not directly answer John Carrier's invitation. Instead, he said, "John, is MGM willing to maintain a strong interest in the 007 series?" John Carrier's heart skipped a beat, but he did not show it on his face. He sighed softly and said, "Eric, you know, we don't have much choice. There is a very good opportunity right now." Eric put down the wine glass and looked at Marcel Noir. "However, this needs Credit Lyonnais to pull the strings." Although Marcel Noir did not know much about movies, he was sensitive enough to realize that Eric's next words would definitely have a great impact on MGM's current situation. "Eric, if Credit Lyonnais can help, we will definitely do our best. Tell us your thoughts." Eric said, "Recently, several film companies and film foundations want to invest in Hollywood. However, Firefly's production plan for the next 2 years has been more than half confirmed. It will be very inconvenient to adjust it, and it will not maximize the profits. Therefore, I think maybe we can cooperate. I will be responsible for selecting the appropriate projects and participating in the production as appropriate. The European film companies and film foundations will be responsible for the investment, and MGM will be responsible for the production and distribution. This will not only solve MGM's current operational difficulties, but also make full use of the European financial advantage." Marcel Noir kept nodding throughout the whole process. After listening carefully to Eric, he turned to look at John Carrier. John Carrier's eyes were also filled with interest. However, compared to Marcel Noir, John Carrier was more aware of the difficulty of implementing Eric's proposal. Although Eric's personal contribution seemed to be the least in this cooperation proposal, in fact, his personal participation was the most valuable part. Just like in the original Spacetime, because of Steven Spielberg's strong appeal, DreamWorks had just announced its establishment, and investors from all over the world rushed to provide more than $1 billion of startup capital. At this time, if it were not for Eric, perhaps those European film companies would not even consider cooperating with MGM. After all, the 2 blockbusters released during the summer had already made them afraid. However, at the same time, the European film companies were the clearest about MGM's current situation. Even with Eric taking the lead, the possibility of them agreeing was still very slim. Eric, personally, I am very much looking forward to this cooperation, but... John Carey was just about to continue speaking when he noticed Marcel Noire's wink, so he stopped speaking. After all, he was only a professional manager at MGM. Seeing that Marcel Noire seemed to be very enthusiastic about this proposal, John Carey could not immediately pour cold water on him. He could only change his tone and said, "But we still have to negotiate with all parties." Marcel Noire immediately interjected, "Eric, we will give you an answer as soon as possible. In addition, Credit Lyonnais will do its best to facilitate this matter." "Then I'll wait for your good news," Eric nodded. The following conversation was much more relaxed. John Carey continued to ask Eric about his opinions on the movie villains. Eric was not stingy and shared some of the theories he had seen in his previous life with John Carey. It was not until 9:30 that the three of them ended the dinner. After paying the bill, John Carey and Marcel Noire walked Eric out of the restaurant. After leaving the restaurant, Eric stood by the roadside and said goodbye to the two. Then, he saw a beautiful figure walking out of the bright restaurant hall. It was Sophie Marceau, whom he had not seen for a few days. At this time, the girl was accompanied by a tall middle-aged man in his 40s. He looked like a typical French. The middle-aged man chattered endlessly as he walked out with Sophie. John Carey and Marcel Noire followed Eric's gaze almost at the same time. John Carey had also attended the fragrance celebration party at the Sedoua's house that night, so he knew some inside information. He winked at Marcel Noire, and John Carey said to Eric, "Eric, in that case, we'll take our leave first." Eric did not mind John Carey and Marcel Noire's teasing and flirting at the same time. After saying goodbye, he took the initiative to walk toward Sophie. When he came close to the two, although Eric did not understand French, he could clearly recognize Sophie's impatient expression. After adapting to the dim light outside, Sophie saw Eric at a glance. The girl's expression was a little surprised at first, then she winked mischievously at Eric and pouted at the middle-aged man beside her. Obviously, she was hinting for Eric to help her out. The middle-aged man noticed the change in Sophie's expression and looked forward. Only then did he see a young man in his 20s walking toward him. The young man was wearing a decent black suit. His face was chiseled, and his temperament was calm and steady. He also gave off a faint sense of oppression that was difficult to ignore. Although he felt that the young man's appearance was somewhat familiar, the middle-aged man could not recognize Eric's identity for a moment. However, he instinctively felt a trace of vigilance. When he saw Eric coming in front of the two of them, the middle-aged man took a slight step forward and reached out to Eric. He said in French, "Hello, my name is Frederick Blonde. May I know who you are?" To the middle-aged man's surprise, the young man in front of him had a look of confusion in his eyes. He looked at the middle-aged man's outstretched hand but had no intention of responding. He just turned his gaze to Sophie. Sophie knew that Eric did not understand much French, so she smiled mischievously. However, she still had to test Eric to help her out. Sophie could only quickly say to the middle-aged man, "He doesn't understand French. You can use English." When Frederick Blonde heard Sophie's words, a trace of contempt flashed in his eyes. However, he still used English to introduce himself again. Eric then reached out to shake his hand. "Hello, I'm Eric Williams." Frederick Blonde immediately remembered Eric's identity after he said his name. They were both in the film industry. Of course, it was impossible for him not to know Eric, the young Hollywood mogul who had created the miracle of Firefly Pictures in just a few years. Thinking of this, Frederick Blonde immediately put away the trace of contempt that had just appeared and said eagerly, "Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a producer at TF1 Film Studio." "Oh, TF1, I know." Eric nodded. He was just about to blurt out names such as Paddington Bear, Air Rescue, Supernatural, but he immediately realized that these were movies more than 10 years in the future. His mind froze and he felt a little embarrassed. He looked at Sophie and said, "That, Sophie's Heartbeat, is from your company, right?" Sophie noticed that Eric was a little embarrassed and laughed. Frederick Blonde did not dare to be as unscrupulous as Sophie. He nodded and said, "Yes, it was jointly invested by us and Gaumont." "Oh." Eric nodded and did not intend to continue the conversation. He pointed to Sophie, who was still grinning without caring about her image, and said, "Sophie and I haven't seen each other for a long time. Do you mind if we talk alone?" "What do you mean by long time? Do I know you that well?" The girl thought to herself. She rolled her eyes at Eric but did not deny it. "Of course. In that case, I'll take my leave first." Frederick Blonde said a few more words to Sophie, said goodbye, and walked towards the parking lot. "Phew, luckily I met you. Otherwise, I wouldn't know how to get rid of this annoying guy." Sophie waited until the middle-aged man's figure disappeared into a white BMW before she said in relief. Eric gestured to the hotel driver not far away and pointed to the Seine River on the other side of the road. "Let's take a walk there." "Ah, okay." Sophie seemed to have realized something, but she did not reject Eric's invitation. She followed him across the road and came to the Seine River. The two walked down the steps all the way to the embankment of the Seine River. The night was dark, and there were many couples strolling on the embankment, but no one paid attention to the two of them. Looking at Sophie, who seemed to have shrunk her neck slightly because of the cold night, Eric asked, "Since you hate that guy, why did you have dinner with him?" "My agent just accepted a movie for me." Sophie seemed to have recalled the unpleasant experience just now and said angrily, "I suddenly received an invitation tonight to talk about the script. In the end, the director and screenwriter left early, leaving only that annoying guy who kept pestering me. If I had known, I wouldn't have come. I only accepted this script because of Alexander Dumas." Listening to Sophie's proud tone, Eric smiled gently and said, "Which one is Alexander Dumas' work?" Sophie said, "The sequel to The Three Musketeers. It's about D'Artagnan's daughter." "Humph, if he keeps pestering me, I won't take it. It's not like I can't find a movie to shoot." Chapter 548. Eric thought to himself that it should be the movie Passion for the Rose, and said, "Since you're not happy, then you might as well not take it." "That's easy for you to say. I still have to make money to support my family." "If I don't act if I'm not happy, then I can forget about acting in anything in the future," Sophie said to Eric in a teasing tone, as if she had forgotten what she had just said. Passing by a street lamp, Sophie stepped on her short shadow and jumped a few times briskly. Her high heels made a series of crisp clicks on the stone floor. The hem of her light blue dress fluttered in the light, occasionally revealing her fair and slender calves. Eric looked at Sophie's slightly childish movements with some affection. He thought to himself that the spirited girl in The First Kiss had not grown up, but she had learned to compromise. He wondered if it was a pity. Sophie jumped a few times and naturally walked to Eric's right side. Eric looked at the soft and beautiful face beside him and said, "Why don't you come to Hollywood? I'll introduce you to a movie." Sophie looked at Eric. Only then did she remember that the young man beside her was the big boss of Firefly Films, who was in the limelight in Hollywood. He was also the director of a series of global hit movies. However, Sophie had never worked with a Hollywood director before. Looking at Eric's youthful face, she really could not feel a sense of awe for this young man's other identity like she did for Frederick Bloom of the TF1 company. The girl was stunned for a moment. Looking at the gentle smile on Eric's face, she suddenly relaxed and said with a smile, "Then tell me what movie it is first. I won't act if I'm not interested." Eric remembered the topic he had just discussed with John Carey in the restaurant and said, "What about the Bond girl?" Sophie immediately said with a look of disdain, "That guy who goes around picking up girls, acting cool, and can save the world?" Eric laughed and said, "Yeah, that guy. Are you interested?" Sophie dragged her tone a little, "Not interested." "Don't be so sure. Why don't you give it a try? You'll definitely become the most beautiful Bond girl in history. If I were to play it, I'd play the villain. I'd kill Bond and destroy the world," Sophie said, showing her white teeth fiercely. But her melancholy face, naturally artistic and melancholy, did not betray any fierceness. "All right, I'll let you be the villain. kill Bond and destroy the world. Sophie turned sideways and stared at Eric's expression for a few seconds. Suddenly, she asked in surprise, "Are you serious?" Eric nodded solemnly. "Of course. Do I look like I'm joking?" "Forget it." Sophie's face suddenly turned red. Even under the dim streetlights, it was very obvious. She threw out this sentence in a panic and then glared fiercely at Eric. "You're a guy who likes to sweet-talk women. I'll never fall for your tricks again." "But I'm clearly discussing this matter with you very seriously," Eric said with an innocent look. "Before I met you, I happened to be discussing the 007 series with John Carey, the president of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures. MGM is likely to use the setting of 2 Bond girls in the latest 007 sequel. If you're interested, I can recommend you to play the villain." Sophie realized that Eric really wasn't joking. She remembered her oversensitive reaction just now and felt a little embarrassed. She unconsciously quickened her pace and walked towards the stairs leading away from the Seine River embankment. Eric looked at the girl's back as she ran away. He smiled and quickly followed her. After leaving the embankment, Eric saw Sophie standing on the side of the road waiting for a taxi. He stepped forward and gently pulled the girl. "How about I send you back? It's not easy to get a taxi right now." Sophie looked at Eric and saw that he was all alone. She smiled and said, "How are you going to send me back?" Eric smiled confidently and mysteriously. "I'll show you a magic trick." Eric raised his right hand and skillfully snapped his fingers. Sophie widened her eyes in anticipation and curiosity. Her beautiful eyes stared at Eric's raised right hand. Then, still nothing happened. The crisp laughter of Schadenfreude soon spread out under the dim yellow street lights. "Ha ha, ha ha ha. Okay, Eric, it's late. I have to go home," Sophie said as she saw a taxi coming from afar. She was about to go up and wave when she was stopped again. Eric pointed at a black car coming from the other side. "Here my car is." The black car stopped in front of them. The driver got out of the car and respectfully opened the door. Eric gently pushed Sophie. Sophie couldn't think of an excuse to refuse, so she got into the back seat. Eric got into the car from the other side and asked, "I still don't know where you live." Sophie rolled her eyes at Eric and deliberately spoke to the driver in French. She then proudly raised her chin at Eric. The black car continued to drive along New York Avenue for a while, then turned into a road in the northwest. It drove through the streets of Paris for more than 10 minutes before stopping in front of a typical 5-story European-style apartment. Sophie said goodbye to Eric and politely thanked the driver. She opened the door, jumped out, and ran toward the apartment. Eric said a few words to the driver and also got out of the car. Sophie quickly entered the password on the door. She was about to open the heavy iron door when she was shocked by Eric's figure next to her. You. What do you want?" Sophie instinctively panicked. Her 2 small hands subconsciously covered her body. Eric looked harmless. "Sophie, I'm thirsty." The woman burst out laughing, but she immediately pulled a long face and glared at Eric. "Eric, can you think of a worse excuse?" Eric pointed at the car that sped away. "There." Sophie looked at the black car that quickly disappeared around the corner. She seemed to have found a reasonable excuse in her heart. She opened the iron door of the apartment and let Eric in. She didn't forget to cover her ears. "You have to leave after drinking water." "No problem. Also, don't mess around." "I swear." "You don't sound sincere at all." "I swear to God." "Don't." "What if God takes his anger out on me?" "I'll let him punish only me." Smooth talker. In the narrow corridor of the apartment, the 2 bickered in a low voice and soon disappeared around the corner. In just a week, Sophie woke up in the arms of a man she didn't know well. She couldn't help but repent for her fall. However, Sophie still didn't understand why she fell so easily when she was next to the man who was holding her at this time. She could only feel that she was very comfortable with Eric. He could always easily guess her thoughts. Even if there were occasional disagreements in their conversations, the disagreements were clear-cut. Moreover, Eric never tried to persuade her to agree with his point of view. He seemed to know from the beginning that she hated the kind of people who liked to preach. Although the two had known each other for less than a week, he seemed to have known her for many years. Sophie even remembered the words Eric said when he first appeared in front of her. "I think I should have known you in my previous life, so I came up to say hello." In an apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, in a cool and sunny summer morning, Sophie suddenly felt that maybe what he said was true. Oh, how silly. Although she felt that her idea was ridiculous, Sophie still turned her body curiously, as if she wanted to take advantage of the fact that he was sound asleep to ask. But just as she turned over, she met Eric's bright eyes. You're awake?" Sophie said, pretending to be calm. Eric could feel Sophie's waist suddenly tighten slightly. Puzzled, he asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Sophie shook her head gently and said, "You should go." Eric reached for the watch on the dressing table and looked at it. It wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. So, he retreated back into the bed and hugged Sophie. He rubbed his chin on the woman's round shoulder and said, "It's still early. Sleep a little longer." Sophie opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she gave up the idea. Since she didn't have any work to do today, she obediently leaned into Eric's arms. At the same time, she twisted her body and pulled Eric's arm to a more comfortable position. The two of them were like little mice snuggling together in the cold winter. After an unknown amount of time, they opened their eyes at the same time as if they had a tacit understanding. Eric sniffed and smelled the faint smell of toast. He said to Sophie, "Am I hallucinating because I'm hungry?" Sophie chuckled and said, "There's a bakery downstairs. I'm hungry too. Get up and buy some bread." Eric immediately bargained, "I don't speak French." "You go." "You don't speak French, and you don't know how to use francs?" Eric buried his head in Sophie's fragrant pillow and continued to act shamelessly, "I'm a big shot. I never carry small change with me." Sophie pinched Eric, feeling both annoyed and amused at the same time. She crawled out of bed and walked to the wardrobe barefooted. She casually picked out a set of loose pink home clothes and put them on. She then took out a few notes from her wallet and walked out the door in her furry slippers. Eric watched the girl's figure disappear. He stretched comfortably and slowly got up to put on his clothes. Then, after a simple breakfast, Eric was kicked out by Sophie again. Strange. Why did she say again? Eric, of course, could empathize with Sophie's feelings. In his past life, Sophie had not worked with Zaraski in any movies for 10 years after she finished filming The Blue Movement in 1991. Now, The Blue Movement was a movie from 2 years ago. Although her relationship with Zaraski had started to fade, just like the movie When Love Becomes a Habit that Sophie had directed herself in her past life, the two of them had not officially separated. It had just become a habit. From some of Sophie's performances in his past life, Eric knew that Sophie had been drifting around Hollywood for many years. What Eric needed to do now was to bring Sophie to Hollywood 2 years before Braveheart was released. This was a simple task for him. From his conversation with Sophie, Eric could also feel that Sophie was not averse to an invitation from Hollywood, or rather, an invitation from him. Back at the hotel, he met with Chris. After a brief discussion, Chris formally submitted an offer to Nokia's management in Finland to acquire Nokia's mobile communications division. Unsurprisingly, Nokia's management rejected Firefly's investment proposal immediately. Nokia's offer was to sell 20% of Nokia's shares in exchange for $250 million of development funds. This proposal was very different from Eric's expectations. However, Eric also knew that, just like Firefly's acquisition proposal, Nokia's proposal was also a test. As for the bottom line of both parties, it would take a long time for negotiations to be finalized. After the formal contact, Chris did not continue to stay in Paris. Instead, he led Firefly's acquisition team to Helsinki, the capital of Finland. Eric remained in Paris, but he kept in close contact with Chris. In addition, to Eric's surprise, The proposal he proposed on the night of his meeting with Marcel Noir of Credit Lyonnais and John Carey of MGM was unanimously opposed by all the film forces in Europe. It was also very obvious that although Eric's proposal had good prospects, no one wanted to step into the mess that was MGM. Over the years, MGM didn't have any outstanding performance other than making a lot of money from Kirk Kerkorian's capital operations. On the other hand, Kirk Kerkorian had never invested a single cent in MGM. MGM's operating method was to continuously issue corporate bonds. They used this method to raise funds to produce and distribute movies. However, after more than a decade, there were not many blockbuster movies produced, and the accumulated debt grew higher and higher. After the box office failures of Bear Peak of the Mountain and Last Action Hero, which were released during the summer, not only could the largest shareholder, Credit Lyonnais, not only could it not obtain any benefits from MGM, but it also had to continue to invest in MGM to prevent MGM from falling into a debt crisis. Under such circumstances, it was not difficult to understand why these European film forces were unwilling to step into this mess. Eric had no choice but to consider for a while, and quickly came up with a plan that was easier to accept. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.